Think you know what pain is? Think again. We live in a world of pain relief, heating pads and doctors on speed dial. We complain about minor aches and treat discomfort like it's an emergency. But what if I told you that our ancestors lived every single day in more pain than most of us will experience in our entire lives? What if constant, grinding, unavoidable pain was just normal? Medieval people didn't wake up feeling good. They woke up already hurt, and it only got worse from there. Pain wasn't something wrong with their bodies, it was proof their bodies were working. We'll explore this forgotten world of everyday agony in this video and learn more about how our ancestors survived when suffering was simply the price of being alive. If you like these videos, I would appreciate if you clicked like or subscribed, as it's important for the channel and it helps others find it too, just like you did. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Every morning in the medieval world started with a quiet negotiation between body and mind. People would open their eyes, not to sunlight streaming through windows, but to the grey half-light that filtered through shutters or gaps in walls. The first sensation wasn't the gentle awareness of a new day. It was the immediate, honest reminder that their body had been through another night of battle with their sleeping arrangements. The bed itself was often the enemy. Picture a wooden frame, sturdy enough, but topped with what had once been a sack of straw. This straw had seen better days, many better days. It had been compressed by months, sometimes years of use, shaped by countless nights into lumps and valleys that seemed designed to find every sensitive spot along a person's spine. Fresh straw brought its own problems, each piece sharp enough to poke through fabric, insistent as tiny needles. Old straw simply gave up, collapsing into strange formations that offered support in all the wrong places. Pillows were luxury items, rare as silk in a peasant's cottage. Most people rested their heads on whatever they could find: a rolled-up cloak, a small sack stuffed with rags, sometimes nothing at all. The concept of a mattress existed mainly in the dreams of the wealthy. For everyone else, comfort wasn't even a consideration. It was a concept that lived somewhere beyond their daily reality. When morning came, the simple act of sitting up became a careful process. Bodies that had spent the night fighting uneven surfaces and cold air responded to movement with a symphony of protests. Knees would crack and pop like old wood, settling in a house. Backs would stiffen immediately, as if the muscles themselves were surprised by the request to function. Necks turned with reluctance, offering only partial cooperation, before suggesting that perhaps today wasn't the best day for looking in all directions. None of this was unusual or alarming. In fact, waking up without some form of discomfort was almost suspicious. It might mean you were getting sick, or perhaps you were too young to understand how the world really worked. Or worse, it might suggest you had access to luxuries that set you apart from your neighbors in uncomfortable ways. Cold weather made everything worse, which in medieval times meant most of the year was an exercise in endurance. Winter mornings brought a special kind of cruelty: muscles that felt frozen into position, fingers that had forgotten how to bend properly, joints that responded to any movement with sharp, immediate reminders of yesterday's physical labor. That first step out of bed was always uncertain, a small gamble with your own body's willingness to support your weight. Sometimes legs would hold steady, ready for another day of work. Other times they would remind you with particular clarity about the grain sacks you'd carried yesterday, and the ones waiting for you today, and all the other heavy things that needed moving in a world where human strength was the primary form of machinery. Pain didn't conveniently disappear overnight. There was no magical reset button that came with sleep. Instead, discomfort accumulated like dust on a shelf, building layers over time. Yesterday's sore back would join last week's strained shoulder, and both would team up with that injury from 3 years ago that never quite healed right, and now announced changes in weather with the reliability of a rooster announcing dawn. Medieval bodies aged with an efficiency that modern people might find shocking. By 30, many individuals moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older, their joints and muscles carrying the accumulated weight of years spent doing physical work without the benefit of proper rest or medical care. Every movement was calculated, Every step planned to minimize discomfort while still accomplishing the endless tasks that rural life demanded. Yet despite all this, nobody stayed in bed longer than absolutely necessary. Remaining horizontal didn't reduce pain, it simply delayed the inevitable. Animals still required feeding, regardless of how their caretakers felt. Fires needed attention, or the whole household would suffer. Fields waited with infinite patience, but seasons didn't, and crops followed their own schedule, indifferent to human comfort. Pain wasn't considered a valid reason to avoid work. It was simply the background condition of existence. It was so universal, so expected, that people barely had language to discuss it in detail. There was no concept of chronic pain as a medical condition. There was just life, and life involved discomfort, the way it involved breathing or eating. Nobody bothered asking how you felt in the morning because the answer was always the same, and always obvious. Of course you hurt, everyone did. The only question that mattered was whether you could still stand up and keep moving forward. This wasn't seen as tragic or unfair, it was simply the way things worked, the price of being alive in a world that demanded constant physical effort just to survive. Medieval mornings didn't begin with gentle stretches or hot beverages or moments of peaceful reflection. They began with the familiar weight of discomfort, reliable as sunrise, and the quiet determination to carry that weight through another day of necessary work. It was a different relationship with the body than modern people understand. One built on endurance rather than comfort, on acceptance rather than expectation of ease. Imagine waking up every single morning knowing that pain was already waiting for you, like an unwelcome houseguest who never leaves. In medieval times, this wasn't just possible, it was guaranteed. Your back ached from sleeping on whatever passed for a bed, but that discomfort would soon be overshadowed by something far worse. Your mouth held secrets, and every single one of them hurt. Toothaches weren't occasional visitors in medieval life, they were permanent residents. Picture this. Nearly everyone you knew carried at least one tooth that throbbed constantly, like a tiny drum beating inside their jaw. Some teeth hurt when the weather changed, which happened to be most of the time back then. The idea of brushing your teeth, flossing, or visiting a dentist simply didn't exist yet. Teeth got cleaned by accident, usually when people ate bread so rough and coarse it worked like sandpaper against their enamel. This wasn't exactly gentle care, but it was all they had. Sugar wasn't ruining teeth yet, because sugar was still a rare luxury. Instead, survival itself was destroying people's mouths. Imagine biting down on grain that still had bits of stone mixed in from the grinding process. Teeth cracked, enamel wore away, layer by layer, and nerves became exposed to the world. Cavities formed slowly, quietly, like secret tunnels being carved inside teeth. Then one day, usually in the middle of the night when pain feels most intense, they would announce themselves dramatically. The timing was always perfect for maximum misery. Infections happened all the time. Abscesses would swell under people's jaws, making their faces look permanently grumpy and swollen. Pus would drain, leaving terrible tastes in mouths. Pain would travel from the tooth, into the ear, behind the eye, and sometimes it felt like it reached straight into a person's soul. But here's the remarkable thing. People just kept going. Taking time off work because your tooth hurt was considered completely impractical. The logic was simple. If you could still walk and lift things, you were basically fine. Pain was just something extra you carried around, like an invisible burden no one could see. There were treatments, technically speaking. People would chew on herbs, hoping for relief. They'd hold cloves against their aching teeth, pressing the spice against the source of their misery. Alcohol was applied generously, both directly to the mouth and internally to the person suffering. When the pain became absolutely unbearable, there was one final option: extraction, but this wasn't performed by trained dentists. Instead, barbers took care of it, or blacksmiths, or really anyone who owned a pair of pliers and felt confident enough to use them on human teeth. Anesthesia meant holding perfectly still and seriously reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. Sometimes the tooth would come out cleanly, like pulling a nail from wood. Other times, it would shatter into pieces, leaving fragments behind. Occasionally, the infection would spread, turning a bad situation into something potentially deadly. People viewed this as unfortunate, certainly, but not particularly shocking. Medical risk was just part of the experience of being alive. Complaining about it didn't improve the outcome, and pain was something you were expected to endure quietly, preferably without bothering anyone else with your suffering. Most people lost teeth by early adulthood. This wasn't embarrassing or unusual, it was completely expected. Having a full set of teeth was actually suspicious. It suggested you were either very young or somehow blessed by divine favor. By middle age, most mouths were landscapes of gaps, worn-down stubs, and teeth that technically still existed, that served no real purpose, except to remind you they were still there. The pain never truly disappeared. It would fade sometimes, retreating into the background, like a quiet hum. Then, without any warning, it would flare up again, sharp and demanding attention. People learned to adapt in creative ways. They chew only on one side of their mouth, avoiding certain textures that triggered the worst jolts of agony. Meals weren't about enjoyment or flavor. They were strategic operations. Every bite required careful positioning, thoughtful chewing, and acceptance that sharp stabs of pain might interrupt the process at any moment. Eating became a negotiation between hunger and suffering. In this world, tooth pain wasn't a problem you solved. It was simply part of who you became. It shaped how you ate, how you slept, how you smiled, and how you moved through each day. Pain became woven into people's personalities, as fundamental as their eye color or the sound of their voice. Life in medieval times had a way of teaching people patience, starting from the very moment they opened their eyes each morning. The human body, you see, was expected to endure things that would send most of us straight to a doctor today. But perhaps nowhere was this more true than with something we rarely think about: our feet. Picture this, if you will. Every single day, people would wake up and place their feet on surfaces that seemed designed to cause misery. Frozen mud that cracked under pressure, jagged stones that found every tender spot, rough wooden floors that splintered without warning. These weren't occasional challenges, mind you. This was simply the world beneath everyone's feet, day after day, season after season. Now you might wonder about their shoes. Surely someone had figured out how to protect feet by then. Well, shoes did exist, but calling them protective would be generous. These were thin pieces of leather, stiff as boards, shaped with all the anatomical consideration of a wooden plank. The concept of left and right feet hadn't quite caught on yet. Neither had cushioning or arch support, or really any acknowledgement that feet might have curves and tender spots worth considering. Most people wore hand-me-downs shoes that had already served someone else's feet, patched and repatched until they were more repair than original shoe. They fit like suggestions rather than actual footwear. Walking in them wasn't really walking. It was more like a careful negotiation between your foot and something that vaguely resembled a shoe. Blisters became constant companions, forming and bursting and healing and forming again in an endless cycle that people simply accepted as part of being alive. Cuts from sharp stones were so common they barely registered as injuries. Bruises from dropped tools, from livestock that stepped in the wrong places, from the general chaos of daily survival. All of this was just Tuesday. Winter brought its own special challenges. Cold would seep through those thin leather shoes, finding every crack and weak seam like water, finding its way downhill. Toes would go numb, then burn, then go numb again. Frostbite wasn't some rare medical emergency. It was seasonal, predictable as the first snow. People expected to lose feeling in their toes come winter. Losing actual toes was unfortunate, certainly, but not exactly shocking news. The thing is, none of this was considered particularly tragic or unusual. A foot that hurt but still carried you where you needed to go was considered a functional foot. Infection lurked beneath it all, of course. Open wounds meeting dirt and grime, with cleaning being minimal at best. Swelling and redness were ignored, until they physically prevented walking, and even then, people often pushed through anyway. By the time someone reached adulthood, they typically walked with some kind of adjustment, a slight limp, an uneven stride, a careful way of placing their feet that minimized the worst of the pain. This wasn't seen as a disability or a problem to solve. This was simply what adulthood looked like. Growing up meant learning to live with discomfort. To accept that movement came with a price. Children learned early that feet were meant to hurt sometimes. They learned to toughen up, to stop making a fuss about pain that wasn't immediately life-threatening. Pain became background noise, something you acknowledged but didn't let stop you. And yet, despite all this, people walked everywhere. To the fields each morning, to markets on trading days, to churches for services, to neighboring villages for whatever business needed handling. There was no choice in the matter. Really, if your feet stopped working, your world became very small, very quickly. So people adapted, the way humans always do. They adjusted their pace, found ways to minimize the worst of it, and kept moving forward. Because in medieval times, healthy feet didn't mean feet that felt good. Healthy feet meant feet that still functioned, despite everything that had been done to them. There's something almost philosophical about it, when you think about it. The idea that functionality and comfort were entirely separate concepts, that you could hurt constantly and still be considered perfectly fine. As long as you could still do what needed doing, it was a different relationship with the human body, one that expected endurance rather than ease. The stomach held a special place in medieval life, though not in the way we might imagine today. It wasn't the center of pleasure or satisfaction. Instead, it was a quiet, persistent source of discomfort, a hollow space that rarely knew the feeling of being truly filled. Picture waking up every morning with that familiar gnawing sensation, that dull ache that sits just below your ribcage. For medieval people, this wasn't a sign that breakfast was overdue. This was simply how life felt, day after day, year after year. The emptiness became as familiar as breathing, as unremarkable as the sound of wind through the trees. Food certainly existed in the medieval world, but abundance was a stranger that rarely visited. Meals revolved around a simple truth: survival came first. Enjoyment was a luxury few could afford. Bread dominated every table, though calling it bread might be generous. Often coarse and gritty, sometimes stale enough to require real effort to chew. It provided the bulk of whatever calories a person might hope to consume. When vegetables appeared, they were welcomed but never guaranteed. Their availability danced with the seasons, disappearing for months at a time, leaving people to remember the taste of fresh greens like a half-forgotten dream. Meat played an even more elusive role, showing up occasionally at meals like a visitor who never stayed long enough to make a lasting impression. Children learned early that the hollow feeling in their stomachs wasn't something to be fixed, but rather something to be managed. Like a creaky joint or a tooth that ached when storms approached, hunger became part of the body's landscape. It wasn't dramatic or sharp, just a constant, gentle reminder that resources were limited and the body was running on the absolute minimum. The sensation was so common that it stopped registering as pain in the traditional sense. Instead, it became something like thirst or fatigue, inconvenient, certainly, but entirely familiar. Young people grew up knowing this feeling so intimately that they developed an almost philosophical acceptance of it. This wasn't suffering in the way we might understand it today. It was simply the baseline of human experience. When harder years arrived, as they inevitably did, this constant companion grew more insistent. Poor harvests, brutal weather, the chaos of war, or the shadow of illness could push people from their usual state of managed hunger into something more serious. But even then, panic remained a luxury few could afford. Work didn't stop because stomachs were empty. In fact, the cruel irony was that hunger often demanded more work, not less. The body responded to these conditions in ways that became part of daily life. Dizziness was common enough that people learned to pause, wait for it to pass, then continue with whatever task demanded attention. Weakness was expected, factored into the rhythm of each day. Occasionally, someone would faint, then get back up with mild embarrassment, as if they had simply stumbled over an uneven stone. Bones grew brittle without proper nutrition, joints ached more frequently, and injuries healed slowly. Pain layered upon pain, creating a quiet symphony of discomfort that played constantly in the background of medieval existence. Yet people adapted with remarkable resilience, developing strategies that stretched resources in ways that might seem desperate by today's standards. Watered-down ale became a source of calories, thin and unsatisfying but better than nothing. Meals were extended with fillers, whatever could add bulk without adding much cost. People ate things that modern palatids would politely decline, finding nourishment in sources that required both creativity and necessity. These conditions shaped more than just bodies, they molded entire ways of thinking. Waste became not just impractical, but almost physically painful to contemplate. Throwing away food wasn't merely unethical. It was an act that went against every instinct developed through years of scarcity. Priorities formed around this reality, creating moral frameworks built on the understanding that abundance was never guaranteed. There's something almost meditative about how medieval people learned to coexist with hunger. It wasn't their enemy, exactly, nor was it their friend. It was simply there, like weather or seasons, something that shaped daily decisions without requiring constant attention. The relationship was practical, born from necessity, refined through generations of experience. This constant companion influenced everything from work schedules to social customs, from religious practices to family dynamics. Meals were planned with mathematical precision, portions calculated not for satisfaction, but for survival. Second helpings existed more in theory than in practice. Dreams of abundance that occasionally flickered through the imagination before being gently set aside. In this world, the sensation of feeling truly full was so rare that it carried an almost suspicious quality. When it did occur, it was often followed by anxiety, rather than contentment, a worried recognition that such indulgence would likely be paid for later. The body and mind had learned to be wary of excess, even when that excess was simply enough food to feel satisfied. Medieval hunger wasn't the dramatic starvation we see in disaster stories or historical accounts of siege and famine. Instead, it was quiet, persistent, woven into the fabric of ordinary life, like thread through cloth. It shaped generations of people who learned to find contentment not in abundance, but in the simple continuation of existence, one carefully managed day at a time. Picture a world where pain wasn't something you treated, but something you simply carried. In medieval times, your back didn't wait for old age to start aching. It began its slow rebellion when you were still small enough to hide behind your mother's skirts. Children back then didn't have childhoods, as we know them. They had tiny apprenticeships in suffering. A 5-year-old who could balance a water bucket was expected to do it, day after day, until their small spine curved like a question mark. Their bodies were still growing, still soft, still forming, but necessity didn't care about development. Water doesn't get lighter because you're 7 years old. Firewood doesn't shrink because your arms are thin. The fields don't harvest themselves because your bones are still hardening. So children learned early that usefulness meant pain, and pain meant you belonged. By the time these children reached their teenage years, their backs had already started telling stories. Stories written in compressed vertebrae, in muscles that had grown strong in all the wrong places, in spines that had bent forward just a little bit, like they were perpetually bowing to some invisible master. The medieval back was a masterpiece of adaptation. It learned to curve where it needed to curve, to strengthen where strength mattered most, to find ways around the hurt. But every adaptation came with a price, and that price was usually paid in different kinds of pain, new aches that bloomed like flowers in places that had been fine yesterday. Adults moved through their world with the careful choreography of people who knew their bodies intimately, not in a loving way, but in the way you know a dangerous neighborhood, mapping out which streets to avoid, which shortcuts led to trouble, which movements would cost them dearly. The work never stopped, never softened, never apologized. Grain sacks didn't care that your lower back screamed when you lifted them. Frozen earth didn't soften just because your spine felt like it might snap. The harvest came when it came, whether you were ready or not, whether your body could take another day of bending and lifting and carrying. Medieval people developed their own unspoken language of pain management, a slight shift of weight from one foot to another, a particular way of breathing when lifting something heavy, a method of carrying buckets that distributed the hurt just enough to keep going. These weren't techniques they learned from books or healers. They were discoveries born from necessity, refined through repetition. When someone's back finally gave out completely, when the pain crossed from bearable to unbearable, there wasn't much to be done. No doctors specialized in spines, no treatments designed to heal what had been broken by decades of use. You adjusted, you adapted, or you became someone others had to care for, which was often more dangerous than the pain itself. The medieval spine told the story of its owner's life. Years of carrying water carved themselves into vertebrae. Decades of harvest left their mark in compressed discs. Winters spent digging through frozen soil wrote themselves in the language of chronic ache. By middle age, many people carried their histories visibly, shoulders rounded forward, backs curved in permanent bows to burdens they were no longer carrying. Their bodies had become archives of labor, museums of survival, monuments to the simple fact that they had endured. What strikes you most about medieval back pain isn't how different it was from today, but how familiar it feels. The same muscles seized, the same joints ached, the same nerves sent their sharp messages up and down the spine. The human body hasn't changed much in a few hundred years, but our relationship with its limitations certainly has. Back then, a straight spine wasn't the goal. Movement was. A pain-free back wasn't expected. Function was. If you could still bend enough to work, still lift enough to be useful, still move enough to survive, you were considered fortunate. Pain was just proof that you were alive. And staying alive was victory enough. Picture a world where your body told stories through its scars, where every hand was a weathered map of daily survival. In medieval times, injury wasn't an event, it was a companion that moved in quietly and never really left. The human body back then carried a different relationship with pain. Small cuts appeared like uninvited guests, settling into the skin and making themselves comfortable. A scraped knuckle here, a burned finger there. These weren't accidents worth mentioning. They were simply Tuesday. Hands bore the heaviest burden of this harsh reality. Think about your own hands for a moment, how soft they might feel, how unmarked. Medieval hands told different stories entirely. They spoke constantly, with rough wood, wrestled with thorns, negotiated with angry metal tools. Every palm carried layers of old wounds beneath fresh ones, creating what you might call a personal museum of survival that nobody asked to curate. The strangest part, perhaps, was how normal this all seemed. A hand without cuts raised suspicion, belonged maybe to a child who hadn't yet earned their place in the working world. Adults expected their skin to carry these small testimonies of useful living. Healing happened differently then, moved at its own stubborn pace. Cleanliness lived by medieval standards, which is to say, barely at all. Bandages came from whatever fabric could be spared, torn from old clothes or grain sacks. The idea of keeping wounds clean remained a distant, unimaginable concept. Daily life meant daily contamination. Dirt found its way into every cut, followed closely by dust, manure, whatever happened to be mixing in the medieval air that day. Pain would flare up, settle down, then return when the same wound cracked open from more work. This cycle repeated itself like seasons, predictable and unavoidable. Fire brought its own particular brand of suffering. Cooking meant dancing with open flames every single day, and the flames didn't always stay where they belonged. Fingers got scorched, reaching for pots, arms got singed. When embers jumped free, serious burns happened when cooking vessels tipped at the wrong moment. Burn scars decorated skin so commonly that they barely warranted comment. Someone might glance at a fresh burn, nod knowingly, and that was the extent of medieval sympathy. Behind every small injury lurked a larger unspoken worry. Infection moved like a shadow, always threatening to transform a simple cut into something far more serious. People watched for the telltale signs: redness spreading outward, swelling that felt warm to the touch, pain that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. As long as a wounded limb still functioned, the wound got ignored. Only when movement stopped completely did real alarms set in, and by then, options had grown tragically limited. Amputation existed as a last resort, but it carried its own deadly risks. Most wounds simply lingered in that uncomfortable middle ground, scabbing over and cracking open in endless cycles. Pain became a familiar roommate rather than an occasional visitor. People developed an intimate knowledge of their own injuries, learned which cuts ached more in cold weather, which ones burned when they got wet, which tender spots absolutely could not be bumped under any circumstances. Children absorbed these lessons early, discovered that tears over small injuries earned sympathy for maybe 3 seconds before life moved on. A scraped knee might get a quick glance, perhaps a gentle word, then it was time to keep walking. Medieval childhood meant learning that your body would collect damage, and crying wouldn't fix any of it. This created a peculiar acceptance, a way of living where wounds weren't temporary setbacks waiting to be healed. They became long-term companions, permanent residents in the landscape of daily existence. Pain served as the body's way of announcing that it was still working, still carrying you through another day of survival. The medieval relationship with physical suffering reveals something profound about human adaptability. When comfort isn't an option, people simply expand their definition of normal. What we might consider unbearable became routine. What we'd rush to treat became part of the background noise of living. Winter settled into medieval bones like an unwelcome guest who never quite learned when to leave. The cold back then, it wasn't just about feeling chilly. It was a living thing that crept through walls, through clothing, through skin itself. Houses in those days, they were more like suggestions of warmth rather than actual warm places. Air moved freely through gaps in walls. Snow found its way through roofs. And fires, well, they were small, smoky affairs that seemed to mock your desperate need for heat. The human body, it has this way of surrendering to cold in a very particular order. Fingers go first, then toes, then anything foolish enough to stick out into the world. Ears, noses, they all learn their place in winter's hierarchy. People back then, they understood this dance intimately. Numbness would arrive, followed by that peculiar burning sensation that makes you wonder how something so cold can feel like fire. There's something almost poetic about how pain reveals itself in stages during those long medieval winters. First comes the sharp, immediate sting, the kind that makes you gasp when you step outside. Your fingers ache as they try to work in freezing air, skin cracks and bleeds like tiny fault lines opening up. Then arrives the deeper ache, settling into joints like old memories. Knees begin their daily protests, wrists throb with a dull persistence that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. Cold has this curious ability to resurrect old wounds, bringing back injuries you thought were long forgotten. It's as if winter keeps a careful record of every stumble, every cut, every moment your body ever failed you. A bad back becomes unbearable. Old cuts suddenly remember how to throb, and tooth pain, well, tooth pain in winter was its own special form of torment. The body becomes a living chronicle of every mistake you've ever made. Frostbite wasn't the dramatic emergency we imagine today. It was quiet, almost polite in its arrival. Skin would fade to pale, sensation would slip away like a retreating tide. Sometimes feeling returned with the spring, sometimes it didn't. Losing sensation in a finger was merely inconvenient. Losing the finger entirely, well, that was unfortunate, but survivable. People adapted because adaptation was the only choice available. Protection from the cold was primitive at best. Gloves were rough, clumsy things when they existed at all. Mittens were better for warmth but rare as summer snow. Most heat came from constant movement, which brought its own particular brand of painful irony. You had to hurt to avoid hurting worse. Sleep offered no sanctuary from winter's grip. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with cold that seemed to seep through blankets, through skin, into the very core of being. Bodies would curl inward, trying desperately to conserve whatever warmth they could generate. Muscles tightened like drawn bowstrings, defending against a cold's invasion. Morning always brought people waking up stiffer than when they'd collapsed into bed, already bracing for another day's battle with the elements. The remarkable thing about medieval people, though, was their relationship with this seasonal suffering. They rarely described cold pain as something extraordinary or worthy of complaint. Winter pain was simply winter, as inevitable and unremarkable as sunrise or rainfall. Complaining about cold would have been like complaining about the pull of the earth beneath your feet. Everyone felt it, everyone endured it, and those who couldn't learn to live with it simply didn't last long enough to pass on their stories. Work never paused for winter's convenience. Fields still demanded attention. Animals still required care. Life continued its relentless march forward, regardless of how much your joints ached or how numb your fingers became. The cold didn't stop the world, it just made everything harder, sharper, more immediate. Every task became a small act of defiance against winter's attempt to slow you down. There's something almost admirable about this quiet acceptance, this understanding that pain was simply part of the seasonal rhythm of existence. Cold wasn't something to be avoided or conquered. It was something you lived inside, like dwelling within a harsh but familiar house. The pain it brought wasn't exceptional or noteworthy. It was expected, seasonal, and accepted as naturally as breathing. For women in medieval times, pain followed an even more predictable schedule, woven into the very fabric of their monthly and yearly existence. For women living in medieval times, nothing shaped their existence quite like the reality of childbirth. It wasn't something that happened once or twice in a lifetime. It was woven into the very fabric of their days, as predictable as the changing seasons, as certain as the harvest. Picture this, if you will. There was no rushing to a hospital, no calling for help at the first sign of labor. Instead, women prepared for birth the way farmers prepared for storms. They gathered what they could, hoped for the best, and accepted what came. The birthing room was simply the main room of the house, maybe with some fresh straw laid down if there was time. When labor began, it wasn't a medical event, it was a community gathering of sorts. The women who came to help weren't trained professionals. They were neighbors, sisters, mothers who had walked this path themselves. They brought their own memories of pain, their own hard-won wisdom about what worked and what didn't. The process itself stretched on for what must have felt like eternity. Hours turned into days sometimes, with no relief in sight. There were no medicines to dull the pain, no techniques to speed things along, just waiting, breathing, and enduring whatever came. The women attending knew that screaming was normal, expected even, but they also knew it wouldn't change anything about what was happening. What strikes you most about this time is how ordinary the extraordinary was considered. Here was this moment that balanced so perfectly between life and death, yet it was treated like any other difficult but necessary task, like harvesting grain in harsh weather or surviving a particularly brutal winter. Something you simply had to get through. The dangers were real, and everyone knew it. Bleeding that wouldn't stop, infections that spread like wildfire, complications that had no names and no solutions. Every woman who entered labor understood she might not emerge from it. Yet this awareness didn't create panic or drama. Instead, it fostered a kind of quiet courage, a resignation that was almost philosophical in nature. Recovery, when it came, was measured in hours rather than weeks. The idea of taking time to heal, to rest, to process what the body had just endured, was a luxury few could afford. There were animals to feed, fires to tend, other children who needed care. The body that had just performed this incredible feat of creation was expected to return to its daily duties almost immediately. Pain became a companion that many women carried for years afterward. Injuries that never quite healed properly, discomfort that settled into bones and stayed there, weakness that had to be worked around rather than treated. These weren't seen as problems requiring solutions. They were simply part of what it meant to be a woman who had given birth. The emotional landscape of these experiences remained largely unspoken. In a world where survival took priority over feelings, there was little room for processing fear, grief, or trauma. Women carried their psychological burdens the same way they carried water from the well, as just another weight that was part of daily life. Losing children was heartbreakingly common. Many women would experience the full journey of pregnancy and birth multiple times, only to watch their babies fail to thrive. Each loss added another layer to the complex relationship between hope and resignation that defined medieval motherhood. Yet even this profound grief was absorbed quietly, privately, without the support systems we might expect. What's perhaps most remarkable is how this cycle continued, generation after generation. Knowledge was passed down through whispered conversations and practical demonstrations. Stories were shared, but they focused on what to do rather than how to feel about it. Pain was acknowledged as inevitable, but not dwelled upon. It was simply another fact of life, like cold winters or failed harvests. This wasn't a matter of women being stronger or weaker than people today. It was about living in a world where pain was so woven into daily existence that extraordinary suffering had to be treated as ordinary business, where survival meant accepting rather than fighting against the harsh realities that shaped every aspect of life. The medieval approach to childbirth reveals something profound about human adaptability. When there are no alternatives, people find ways to endure the unendurable. They create meaning from suffering, find strength in acceptance, and build communities around shared hardship. These women didn't have choices we take for granted today, but they had something else, a kind of matter-of-fact courage that carried them through experiences that would seem impossible to bear. When the sun set on another day of endless tasks, medieval women faced a challenge that arrived with clockwork regularity. Their bodies would remind them, month after month, that being a woman came with its own particular set of trials. Picture this, if you will. A cramping sensation that starts deep in your belly, spreading like ripples through your back and legs. Now imagine having no choice but to continue grinding grain, hauling water from the well, or chasing after children while this pain pulses through you. There were no sick days in medieval times, no understanding supervisors, no heating pads or gentle remedies waiting at the local pharmacy. The medieval world was not built for privacy, you see. Families crowded into single rooms, sometimes sharing their space with animals for warmth. Everyone knew everyone's business, yet somehow this most feminine of experiences remained shrouded in awkward silence. Women developed their own secret language of meaningful glances and subtle nods, communicating their monthly struggles without ever speaking the words aloud. What strikes you most about this time is how women simply, carried on. The field still needed their attention, regardless of whether standing upright made them dizzy. Bread still needed kneading, even when their backs screamed in protest. Children still needed feeding and soothing, no matter how much their own bodies ached for comfort. It's fascinating how these women became masters of their own pain, learning to read their bodies like weather patterns. They could predict which days would bring the worst of it, when to move a little slower without anyone noticing, when they could push through, and when they absolutely had to find a quiet moment to steady themselves against a wall. The remedies Aurelia. Some women turned to herbs, whatever grew wild in their region, that might offer even the smallest relief. Others relied on prayer, hoping that divine intervention might ease their suffering. Rest was prescribed by those few who understood the female body, but rest was a luxury most couldn't afford. Think about the sheer resourcefulness required for the practical matters. Women fashioned their own protection from whatever materials they could find: old cloth strips, moss gathered from the forest, rags that had to be washed secretly, and dried discreetly. Leaks were inevitable, stains were embarrassing, and the shame that followed was yet another burden to carry. Medical understanding of the time was, to put it kindly, rather creative. Many believed that menstruation was simply the body's way of releasing excess blood, like opening a valve on an overfilled container. When pain accompanied this process, some saw it as evidence of moral weakness or spiritual imbalance. These theories provided little comfort and even less effective treatment. The physical demands of medieval life showed no mercy to women experiencing monthly pain. They bent over crops in the fields, lifted heavy pots and pans, knelt on hard stone floors to scrub and clean, all while their bodies protested with each movement. The pain became just another sensation to file away, alongside the constant companions of hunger, exhaustion, and cold that defined daily existence. What's perhaps most remarkable is how this suffering remained largely invisible to the wider world. Women learned to mask their discomfort so thoroughly that their monthly battles went unrecognized and unacknowledged. Complaining was discouraged, endurance was celebrated, and silence became the expected response to pain that was both universal and deeply personal. Over time, each woman developed her own survival strategies, passed down perhaps from mother to daughter in whispered conversations. They learned which positions brought slight relief, how to time their most demanding tasks around their worst days, and how to find those precious few moments of rest without appearing lazy or weak. This monthly trial shaped medieval women in ways that history rarely discusses. It taught them resilience, certainly, but also a particular kind of loneliness. To suffer regularly, predictably, and yet never be able to speak of that suffering openly, created a strange isolation even within the closest communities. Looking back, we see women who transformed unavoidable pain into quiet strength, who found ways to nurture others while their own bodies demanded care they couldn't provide. They carried on because they had to, because the world around them offered no alternative, because usefulness was valued above comfort, productivity above well-being. Their endurance becomes a testament not just to human resilience, but to the particular burden of being useful in a world that had little time for the complexities of being human. Picture a world where your body starts whispering complaints before you've even finished growing up. In medieval times, pain wasn't something that knocked on your door politely in your golden years. It moved in early, made itself comfortable, and decided to stay for the rest of your life. The rhythm of medieval work had a cruel kind of poetry to it. The same bend, the same twist, the same lift, repeated endlessly, like a song that never changes its tune. Your body was expected to dance to this monotonous music, day after day, season after season. There was no concept of variety, no understanding that muscles and bones might crave different movements. Knees bore the brunt of this harsh reality first. They met the cold, unforgiving ground thousands of times, planting seeds, tending crops, scrubbing floors. The earth showed no mercy to these joints that carried entire lives upon them. Swelling became as common as sunrise, stiffness as predictable as winter. Young people learned the careful art of rising slowly, not from age, but from necessity. Their knees had already begun their quiet rebellion against the demands placed upon them. Hands told their own stories of struggle. Wrists that twisted rope, gripped tools, and carried burdens developed their own language of aches. Fingers that once moved with the grace of youth grew thick and clumsy, especially when the cold seasons arrived. The delicate work that required nimble movements became increasingly difficult, but this was simply accepted as part of growing up, not growing old. Shoulders carried more than their fair share of life's weight. Heavy yokes pressed down on them, compressing joints that were never designed for such constant pressure. Arms grew weaker, not from time, but from the relentless demands of survival. What we might call rotator cuff injuries simply became the quiet reality of having one side that worked a little less well than the other. The condition we now call arthritis lived nameless in medieval bodies. Morning stiffness was as routine as breakfast, rainy day aches as common as clouds. People developed an intimate knowledge of their own limitations. learning to favor certain movements, avoiding others entirely. Their bodies became carefully choreographed performances, designed to minimize discomfort while maximizing productivity. There were no remedies, no treatments, no understanding that these conditions could be managed or improved. Pain existed in a strange category, neither fully acknowledged as illness nor dismissed as imagination. It was simply part of the human experience, like hunger or fatigue. A joint that hurt but still moved was considered perfectly functional. By the time people reached what we would consider middle age, they had developed an almost artistic efficiency in their movements. Every gesture was calculated, every motion planned with the precision of a master craftsman. This wasn't the caution of the elderly, but the hard-earned wisdom of bodies that had learned to negotiate with pain. There's something almost philosophical about how medieval people viewed their aching joints. Pain became a badge of honor, proof of useful work, evidence of a life fully lived. Your knees might protest every morning, your shoulders might ache with every storm, but these sensations confirmed something important. They whispered that you had contributed, that you had survived, that you were still valuable to your community. In this world, joint pain wasn't a medical concern requiring attention. It was simply confirmation that you belonged to the great human story of work, endurance, and quiet resilience. Even if your body had other opinions about the matter, picture a world where waking up meant accepting that today would hurt, just like yesterday did, and tomorrow probably would too. Medieval people understood something we've forgotten, that the human body was never really meant to feel perfectly fine. Pain wasn't an emergency, it was Tuesday. When you think about it, our ancestors lived in a constant state of what we'd now call being unwell. Their normal included aches we'd rush to a doctor for, a headache that lasted weeks. Well, that was just another headache. Stomach cramps that doubled you over. That was dinner disagreeing with you again. The concept of feeling truly healthy, completely pain-free, simply didn't exist for most people. Fevers came and went like weather patterns. You'd burn up for days, then cool down, then burn up again. Nobody expected this to be quick or comfortable. Time moved differently when you were sick, but life certainly didn't stop moving around you. Animals needed feeding, crops needed tending, children needed watching. The world kept spinning whether your head was pounding or not. Here's something fascinating. People back then had a completely different relationship with their own bodies. They expected betrayal. Your stomach would cramp, your joints would ache, your skin would break out in mysterious rashes. This wasn't your body failing you. This was your body being a body. The idea that you deserved to feel good, that comfort was a right rather than a luxury, that simply didn't compute. Cars were particularly interesting in medieval life. A cough could settle in for months, becoming almost like a companion. People would introduce themselves, and their cough would chime in right after. These weren't necessarily deadly coughs, just persistent ones that reminded you, every few minutes, that breathing was work. The medieval approach to parasites tells you everything about their mindset. Having worms wasn't a medical condition, it was practically a life stage. Children had worms, adults had worms. Probably the worms had smaller worms. This was considered as natural as having hair or fingernails. The discomfort, the weakness, the way worms would steal nutrition from your body. Well, that was just the price of being alive. When medical treatment did happen, it often involved making you feel worse before you felt better, if you felt better at all. Bloodletting was the star performer here, already weak from illness, already struggling, and the solution was to make you weaker by removing blood. The logic was charmingly simple. If something hurt inside, maybe there was too much something inside, so let's remove some of that something. The strange thing is, sometimes this approach worked, not because removing blood cured anything, but because surviving bloodletting proved you were strong enough to recover from whatever was originally wrong with you. It was like a very painful, very dangerous fitness test. Herbal medicines occupied this curious middle ground between hope and resignation. People knew which plants might help, which ones definitely wouldn't, and which ones might accidentally kill you faster than your original problem. But when you're already miserable, trying something that might make you more miserable seemed reasonable. At least you were doing something. Recovery in medieval times meant something completely different than it does now. You didn't recover to perfect health, you recovered to functional health. Good enough to work, good enough to contribute, good enough to not be a burden. The bar was set much lower, but maybe that made it easier to clear. Children learned this lesson early and thoroughly. Being sick didn't earn you sympathy, it earned you quiet time. A sick child was expected to suffer silently, to cope without complaint, to understand that their discomfort was just part of growing up. Only when a child became truly dramatically, obviously dying would adults step in with concern. Communities had their own brutal logic about illness. They'd help you when you couldn't work. Not because they loved you though, they might, but because losing workers meant everyone suffered more. Your health was tied to everyone else's survival. Your pain was your problem, but your death was everybody's problem. What's remarkable is how this shaped people's expectations. Nobody expected to feel great. Nobody expected quick fixes or complete cures. They expected to endure, to adapt, to keep going, despite everything their body was doing to slow them down. In a way, there's something almost admirable about that resilience, even if we wouldn't want to live that way ourselves. Medieval illness was less about healing and more about lasting, less about comfort and more about continuation. People measured success not by how good they felt, but by how long they kept feeling anything at all. When medieval folks opened their eyes each morning, the aches and pains weren't unwelcome visitors. They were familiar companions that confirmed something important. You had survived another night. These sensations weren't signals that anything was broken or wrong. They were gentle reminders that life was still coursing through your body. The whole idea of sleep back then, well, it wasn't really about feeling refreshed or restored like we might expect today. Sleep was more like your body's way of temporarily shutting down when it simply couldn't argue with exhaustion anymore. Think of it as survival's brief intermission, a necessary pause before the next act began. Those medieval beds, they weren't exactly the welcoming havens we might imagine. Picture surfaces that you learned to tolerate rather than enjoy. The straw stuffing had this peculiar habit of shifting throughout the night, creating new lumps and valleys that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Wooden frames would creak and groan like old ships in a harbor, announcing every movement you made. When someone actually managed to sleep soundly, it usually meant their body had simply given up the fight, surrendered to whatever discomfort surrounded them. Waking up stiff and sore wasn't considered a sign of poor sleep quality. It was actually proof that sleep had happened at all. The night itself brought its own special collection of challenges. As the fires slowly died down, cold would creep in like an uninvited guest, causing muscles to tighten up defensively. Old injuries, those faithful reminders of past adventures, would take the opportunity during these quiet hours to announce that they were still very much present and accounted for. People found themselves waking up frequently, not because they felt refreshed and ready to start the day, but because they needed to shift position, moving slowly and carefully to avoid angering any particularly sensitive spots. These movements became a careful dance, performed in the darkness. The soundscape of medieval nights was far from peaceful. Animals would shuffle and move about, wind would rattle through walls and shutters, and other people, well, they had their own symphony of snores, coughs, and sleep-talking. Privacy was essentially a foreign concept. Silence was more of a happy accident than something you could count on. Managing a full night of uninterrupted sleep meant you were either extraordinarily exhausted or blessed with unusual luck, and either of these conditions tended to last very long. Then there were all those nighttime responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. Fires needed attention to keep burning. Animals required checking on, babies would cry out for comfort, and sick family members needed careful watching. Sleep became fragmented, broken into small pieces that never quite assembled themselves into anything resembling true rest. People learned to operate in a state of permanent tiredness, their bodies moving more on habit and muscle memory than on actual energy reserves. This constant state of fatigue created a kind of background pain that colored everything else. Headaches would bloom from poor sleep, muscles couldn't recover properly, joints would stiffen even further without adequate rest. When you're tired, everything else hurts more intensely. Hunger becomes sharper, cold cuts deeper into your bones, and injuries seem to throb with extra enthusiasm. There was no such thing as sleep advice or guidance about proper rest. No one talked about posture, or the right kind of pillows, or keeping consistent bedtime schedules. The human body had to adapt in the only way it knew how, by gradually lowering its expectations of what feeling good actually meant. People developed an instinct for conserving energy, making fewer unnecessary movements, accepting that exhaustion was simply the normal baseline of human existence. Children grew up observing adults function this way, and naturally assumed this was just how life worked, because for them, it was. The goal wasn't to wake up feeling energized and ready to conquer the world. The goal was much simpler, to feel capable enough to keep moving forward through another day. Medieval sleep wasn't about restoration or renewal. It was about giving survival a brief pause. So when those medieval people stirred awake each morning, feeling stiff and uncomfortable, it wasn't a sign that something had gone wrong with their rest. It was actually a quiet confirmation that they had successfully navigated through another night, that they were still here, still breathing, still ready to face whatever the new day might bring their way. Picture medieval life and imagine how pain worked back then. The body and the mind weren't separate kingdoms fighting different wars. They were one territory, experiencing everything together. When something hurt, whether it came from loss, or fear, or worry, it all settled into the same places. The chest would tighten, the stomach would twist, the shoulders would carry invisible weight. Think about waking up each morning, knowing that your survival depended on things you couldn't control. Disease might sweep through your village. The lord of the land might decide you owed him more than you could give. Your muscles would stay tight, ready for trouble. Your breathing would stay shallow, as if taking a deep breath might invite disaster. Your head would ache from the constant vigilance. This wasn't called anxiety back then. People didn't have that word, or that concept. They simply said they felt heavy, or weak, or unwell. The tight jaw, the restless sleep, the stomach that never quite settled, these were just part of being alive, just part of being human. Death was a frequent visitor in medieval times. Not a shocking stranger who arrived unexpectedly, but more like a neighbor who dropped by regularly. Children died from illnesses we barely remember now. Mothers died in childbirth. Fathers died from injuries that today would be minor. Friends would simply disappear one day, claimed by plague, or war, or accident. When someone died, there was grief, of course. But there wasn't time for the kind of mourning we might expect today. There were crops to tend, animals to feed, mouths that still needed filling. Grief became something you carried, like a heavy sack that never got set down. It lived in your chest, made your limbs feel tired, turned food to ash in your mouth. People learned to function while carrying this weight. They had no choice. Stopping wasn't an option when survival required constant motion, constant work, constant vigilance. So the sadness stayed inside, finding its own ways to express itself. Through headaches that lasted for days, through chest pain that had no clear cause, through stomach troubles that came and went like unwelcome guests. Fear was another constant companion. Fear of famine, when the harvest might fail, and winter would bring starvation. Fear of sickness, when a fever could mean death, and there was little anyone could do to help. Fear of those in power, who held your fate in their hands and whose moods could change like weather. This fear didn't just live in thoughts, it lived in clenched muscles, in shoulders that never quite relaxed, in sleep that came fitfully and left you tired. It showed up in digestive problems that seemed to have no cure, in a racing heart that wouldn't slow down. Medieval people couldn't say, "I'm stressed," or I'm having anxiety. Those concepts didn't exist yet. They could only describe what their bodies told them. I feel ill, I feel weak, I feel heavy. And these feelings were accepted as normal, as part of what it meant to be human. Expressing emotional pain too loudly was seen as self-indulgent or disruptive to the community. Strength meant enduring quietly, carrying your burdens without complaint. So people learned to suffer in silence, and their silence made the suffering settle deeper into their bodies. Religion provided a framework for understanding this pain. Suffering wasn't meaningless. It could be a test of faith, a lesson in humility, a way to grow closer to the divine. This didn't make the pain disappear, but it gave it purpose. And sometimes, having a reason for pain mattered more than having relief from it. People found ways to cope, small ways that might seem insignificant to us now. The warmth of a fire on a cold night, a familiar meal shared with family. The comfort of routine, of knowing what came next. These tiny pleasures weren't enough to erase the pain, but they made it bearable. Happiness wasn't the goal back then. It wasn't even expected. The goal was stability, predictability, the simple continuation of life. And when you achieved that, when you made it through another day, another season, another year, that was enough. That was everything. So when we look back at medieval times, we might imagine people who were somehow different from us, somehow stronger or more capable of handling hardship. But they weren't different at all. They felt the same emotions, the same fears, the same grief. They just didn't have the words we have, or the understanding we have about how emotions work. Their pain was real, and it was physical, and it was carried quietly through lives that demanded constant resilience. They endured not because they were superhuman, but because they had no other choice. And in their quiet endurance, there's something both heartbreaking and deeply admirable. In those long-ago centuries, when life moved slower and harder, people carried a different relationship with suffering. Pain wasn't the enemy we know today. It was more like an old companion, always there, demanding nothing more than acknowledgement. Picture a world where hurting was woven into the very fabric of existence. Where the ache in your bones after a day's labor wasn't something to eliminate, but something to accept with quiet dignity. Medieval folks didn't wake up wondering how to make the pain go away. They woke up wondering how to work alongside it. The curious thing is, this wasn't resignation. It was philosophy in action. Pain became a teacher. Strange as that sounds. A sore back from hauling grain, well, that taught you about your place in the world. Tooth pain gnawing at your jaw, that was life reminding you to stay humble. Every throb and ache carried meaning, like letters written in a language everyone understood. Children learned this alphabet of suffering early. A scraped knee didn't call for fuss or worry. It called for getting back up, brushing off the dirt, and carrying on. Fatigue was just another word in their vocabulary, not a reason to stop. By the time these children grew up, they spoke pain's language fluently, without really thinking about it. Communities had their own way of honoring this endurance. The person who kept working despite feeling awful, they earned quiet respect. Not the loud, showy kind of praise we might expect today. Just a nod, a recognition that here was someone who understood the rules of living, someone who knew that work didn't pause for discomfort. But here's where it gets interesting. Religion painted all this suffering with spiritual colors. Every moment of pain could be transformed into something valuable, something that mattered beyond the physical world. A test of faith, perhaps, a way to earn grace. Sometimes even a gentle punishment that helped you grow stronger. This wasn't about enjoying pain, mind you. Medieval people weren't seeking out suffering for fun. They were learning to read it differently, like looking at storm clouds and seeing tomorrow's rain for the crops, instead of just seeing trouble. The practical side of this mindset shaped everything. When pain arrived, the first question wasn't about relief or medicine or rest. It was simpler, more direct. Can you still do what needs doing? If yes, then the pain was just background noise, like wind in the trees or dogs barking in the distance. Only when pain actually stopped someone from fulfilling their duties did it become a real problem worth addressing. Until then, it was personal business, something you managed quietly, without making it everyone else's concern. This created a strange kind of strength. People developed an almost supernatural ability to work through discomfort, not because they were tougher than us necessarily, but because they trained themselves to expect pain as normal. Like learning to sleep through the sound of rain on the roof, communities reinforced these expectations in subtle ways. Help appeared when someone truly couldn't function, but it came with invisible timers attached. Everyone understood that assistance was temporary, that recovery meant getting back to your responsibilities as quickly as possible. Lingering in weakness made others uncomfortable, like staying too long at a dinner party. The beautiful and terrible truth of it all was how this approach actually worked. In its own harsh way. Fear of pain can paralyze us, but when pain becomes expected, when it's just another part of the day's weather, fear loses much of its power. Energy that might have gone toward worry or resistance could flow toward simply continuing, step by step, breath by breath. Medieval life demanded a particular kind of endurance, and this relationship with pain was part of that survival strategy. Not cruel, exactly, just pragmatic in ways that feel foreign to us now. They understood something we've perhaps forgotten, that reframing suffering as normal, rather than catastrophic, could be its own form of medicine. There's something almost poetic about how medieval people understood their bodies. They knew, without anyone having to tell them, that flesh and bone were temporary things. Every morning brought reminders. A stiff back from sleeping on straw, fingers that took time to bend after a cold night, shoulders that remembered yesterday's labor. These weren't complaints waiting to be fixed. They were simply the terms of existence. Like knowing the sun would set, or that winter would come, medieval folks accepted that their bodies would hurt. It wasn't personal. It wasn't unfair. It just was. Imagine waking up each day, never expecting to feel entirely well. That might sound depressing to us, but there's a strange freedom in it too. No disappointment when your knee aches. No frustration when your hands are sore. Pain becomes just another part of the landscape, like hills you walk over or weather you dress for. By the time someone reached what we'd call their 40s, they moved differently. Not dramatically, not with great suffering, just carefully. They knew which movements cost more than others. They learned to lift with their legs before anyone coined that phrase. They discovered how to save energy without thinking about it. This wasn't medical knowledge passed down through books. It was wisdom earned through countless small moments. The realization that complaining about inevitable things wastes breath better used elsewhere. That your body, like an old cart, still gets you where you need to go, even if the wheels squeak a bit. Medieval people developed what we might call pain literacy. They could read the different languages their bodies spoke. Sharp pain meant stop immediately. Dull ache meant proceed with caution. Stiffness meant move slowly until things loosened up. This wasn't learned in schools. It was learned in fields, workshops, kitchens. What strikes you, when you really think about it, is how this shaped entire communities. Everyone understood that everyone else was probably hurting somewhere. There was a shared knowledge that bodies were fragile things, doing their best. Maybe that made people more patient with each other, in ways we've forgotten. A person might have a bad back, sore hands and creaky knees, all at the same time, but they'd still laugh at jokes, still fall in love, still get angry about unfair treatment, still feel joy when their children took first steps. Pain didn't erase other experiences, it just became part of the mix. There's something both heartbreaking and admirable about this acceptance. Medieval people weren't superhuman. They felt every ache we do, maybe more. But they'd built their entire understanding of life around the fact that bodies wear down, that comfort is temporary. That strength isn't about avoiding pain, it's about continuing despite it. They didn't have the luxury of expecting their bodies to feel good. That expectation, which feels so natural to us, would have seemed bizarre to them. A perfectly pain-free day might actually worry a medieval person. Had they forgotten to do something important? Were they getting soft? Hard work was supposed to hurt. Cold weather was supposed to be uncomfortable. Long days were supposed to leave you tired and sore. This wasn't punishment. It was proof you were alive, participating, contributing. Pain became almost like a receipt, showing you'd paid your dues for another day of existence. Medieval pain was rarely the star of anyone's story. It was more like background music, always playing, but not drowning out the melody of daily life. People got married while their backs ached. They celebrated harvests with sore hands. They raised children, despite tired bones. Life happened around the pain, through it, with it. Perhaps most remarkably, this created a different relationship with the body itself, not as something that should serve you perfectly, but as a companion that did its best under difficult circumstances. Like a faithful horse that's seen too many hard roads, but still carries you forward. The medieval world demanded endurance the way ours demands efficiency, and people developed that endurance not through heroic acts, but through countless small accommodations. Learning to sleep despite discomfort, working despite stiffness, walking despite sore feet, small victories that added up to entire lifetimes of persistence. The hooves had finally stopped thundering. After generations of terror, after cities turned to ash, after entire kingdoms vanished overnight, the great storm of conquest was settling into something else entirely. By the mid-1200s, the world had learned a hard truth about empires. They can only grow so far so fast before they must pause and decide what to do with everything they've swallowed. The Mongols found themselves in a curious position. Masters of half the known world, yes, but now what? You can't keep burning cities when you need their taxes. You can't keep scattering populations when you need their labor. The very territories that had once screamed under Mongol hooves now needed to work, to produce, to contribute. And so began one of history's strangest transformations. Where chaos had reigned, a peculiar kind of order began to take shape. Not gentle order, mind you, not the kind built on consent or tradition. This was order imposed by the memory of violence, maintained by the promise of more violence if needed, but it was order nonetheless. Roads that had been torn apart by war were suddenly being repaired. Borders that had shifted with each battle became fixed, predictable. Bandits, who had thrived in the confusion of endless warfare, found themselves hunted down with mechanical precision. The Mongols had discovered something that would define their empire for the next century. Fear is a powerful tool, but it's not the only tool. A merchant who's too terrified to travel is a merchant who can't pay taxes. A farmer who's constantly fleeing war is a farmer who can't grow crops, so they created something the world hadn't seen in generations: safety for those who submitted. Picture this: caravans that had once moved like military expeditions, bristling with guards and weapons, suddenly traveling light. Silk merchants from China walking beside spice traders from Central Asia. Silver changing hands from one end of the continent to the other. Ideas flowing along trade routes, like water, finding its level. All of this under the watchful eye of an empire that cared very little about who you were, as long as you paid your dues. This wasn't peace as we might imagine it today. Justice was swift and often brutal. Rebellion wasn't just crushed, it was erased so thoroughly that others would think twice for generations. But within those harsh boundaries, life could be surprisingly predictable. A farmer in Hungary could plant crops with reasonable confidence. They'd still be his to harvest. A scholar in Baghdad could debate philosophy without worrying that his city might be ashes by winter. The Mongols understood something that many rulers before them had missed. Information is power, but only if it moves quickly. They built something remarkable, a vast network of roads and relay stations stretching across continents. Messages that once took months to deliver now traveled in days. Orders from the heart of the empire could reach its edges while they were still relevant. Reports from distant provinces could influence decisions before problems became disasters. For the first time in human history, Eurasia began to function as a single space, not unified by culture or religion or language, but by the simple reality of Mongol authority. A letter written in the capital of the empire could reach the furthest corners of that empire, while the ink was still fresh. Goods, ideas, people, all moving along arteries that the Mongols kept clear and safe through sheer, ruthless efficiency. But perhaps most remarkable was what the Mongols didn't care about. Your gods, your customs, your local traditions, these were irrelevant to them. Pay your taxes, follow the basic laws, don't rebel, and you could worship however you pleased. This indifference, born of practicality rather than tolerance, created something unexpected. Space for cultures to meet and mingle without the pressure to choose sides. The memory of destruction still lingered, of course. Everyone knew what happened to cities that resisted. Everyone had heard the stories of populations scattered to the winds. This knowledge hung over everything like a storm cloud that might break at any moment. Yet life went on, and in many ways, life got better. Trade flourished in ways that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. A bolt of silk could travel from China to Europe, along roads that were safer than they'd been in centuries. Silver mined in Central Asia could buy spices grown in distant lands, carried by merchants who no longer needed to fear bandits at every mountain pass. The Mongols had learned that a live merchant is worth more than a dead one, and they protected their revenue streams accordingly. It was a strange peace, built on the foundation of terrible violence, maintained by the promise of more violence if needed. But it worked. For roughly a century, much of Eurasia experienced something it hadn't known for generations. Stability. Not the stability of love or loyalty, but the stability of predictable consequences. Step out of line, and the hammer falls. Stay within the boundaries, and you can build something, create something, trade something. The world had learned to live with the Mongols, and perhaps more surprisingly, the Mongols had learned to live with the world they'd conquered. The storm had passed, leaving behind roads instead of ruins, and in the calm that followed, civilization found new ways to flow across the vast spaces of the earth. In the vast expanse of medieval Asia, something remarkable was taking shape, something that would change how empires thought about control. The Mongols had discovered that true power didn't come from endless battles. It came from making people believe that resistance was pointless. They built their empire not just with horses and arrows, but with something far more subtle, the careful architecture of fear and reward. At the center of this system sat the Yasa, a collection of laws that Genghis Khan had crafted and his heirs had polished over time. These weren't the kind of flexible rules that local nobles could bend to their whims. They were hard, unforgiving, and most importantly, they applied to everyone equally. In a world where justice usually depended on who you knew or how much you could pay, this consistency felt almost magical. The Mongols treated crime like a disease that could spread if left unchecked. A merchant who stole from a caravan wasn't just hurting his victim, he was threatening the entire web of trade that held the empire together. So theft meant death, banditry meant death, fraud meant death. It sounds harsh to our ears, but there was a cold logic to it. When a trader loaded his camels with silk in China, he needed to know those goods would reach Persia intact. When a messenger carried imperial orders across the steppes, he couldn't worry about bandits hiding behind every hill. This wasn't cruelty for entertainment, it was engineering. The Mongols had figured out that a little fear, applied precisely, could eliminate the random violence that made long-distance trade nearly impossible everywhere else. Caravans that once needed small armies for protection, the roads themselves had become weapons of peace. But here's where the Mongols showed their true genius. They didn't sweep away every local ruler and custom they encountered. Instead, they built their system on top of what already existed. A Chinese governor could keep governing Chinese people in Chinese ways. A Persian prince could maintain Persian traditions, but now they all answered to Mongol overlords. It was like adding a new floor to a house without tearing down the foundation. This approach did something clever It reduced the urge to rebel. People could keep their familiar leaders and customs. They just had to accept that ultimate authority now came from somewhere else. The message was simple: pay your taxes, follow imperial orders, and we'll leave you mostly alone. Fail to do either, and you'll discover why entire cities had vanished earlier in the conquests. Perhaps most surprising of all was how the Mongols handled religion. In an age where empires often tried to force their beliefs on conquered peoples, the Mongols took a different path entirely. They simply didn't care what their subjects believed. Buddhists could chant, Muslims could pray, Christians could worship, shamans could perform their rituals, all under the same imperial sky. Religious leaders often found themselves exempt from certain taxes, not because the Mongols had suddenly become generous, but because they understood something fundamental about human nature. A population focused on prayer and ritual was a population not focused on rebellion. Spiritual leaders who felt protected by the empire were unlikely to preach resistance from their temples and mosques. The peace that emerged from all this, what we now call the Pax Mongolica, rested on a foundation that was both brilliant and terrifying. It was built on reputation as much as reality. Stories of cities that had dared to resist and had been wiped from the map entirely spread like whispers in the night. These tales served as constant reminders of what defiance could cost. Children grew up hearing these stories. Merchants shared them at trading posts. Travelers carried them from town to town. They became part of the cultural fabric, those stories that happened to be true. The Mongols had weaponized memory itself, turning past destruction into present deterrence. Yet for those willing to accept this new reality, the rewards were undeniable. Roads that had been death traps for centuries became safe highways. Laws that had changed with every local lord's mood became predictable and consistent. A merchant in Baghdad could now do business with a craftsman in Beijing, confident that contracts would be honored and goods would arrive. The transformation touched ordinary lives in ways both small and profound. A farmer could sell his surplus grain to traders heading for distant markets, knowing payment would come through reliable channels. An artisan could invest time in learning new techniques, confident that political chaos wouldn't destroy his workshop next month. A family could plan for the future instead of just surviving the present. This was peace, but it was peace with a blade behind it. The Mongols had created something like a vast protection racket, but one that actually delivered on its promises. Submit to our authority and we'll protect you from the chaos that plagued your ancestors. Resist and become a cautionary tale for the next generation. Most people, when faced with this choice, chose submission. They paid the price that order demanded, collected the benefits that stability provided, and got on with the business of living their lives. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't gentle, but for many it was better than the endless cycle of local wars and petty tyrannies they had known before. The Mongols had discovered something that would echo through history, that sometimes the most lasting conquests aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when people decide that cooperation serves them better than resistance. Picture, if you will, a world where distance suddenly became smaller, where a merchant could look at a map and instead of seeing impossible barriers, see possibilities stretching endlessly ahead. This is what happened when the Mongols created something remarkable, a system that made the impossible feel ordinary. You see, the Mongols understood something profound about power. They knew that ruling vast lands wasn't really about having the biggest army, though they certainly had that. It was about connection. It was about making sure that what happened in one corner of their empire could be known in another corner, quickly. So they built something called the Yam. Think of it as the world's first, truly efficient postal system. But this wasn't just for letters. This was a network of roads and stations, stretching across thousands and thousands of miles. Every few dozen miles, there would be a station, fresh horses waiting, food prepared, beds ready. It was like a relay race, but instead of passing batons, they were passing messages, people, and news. The speed was absolutely astounding. A message that once took months to travel now took mere days. Imagine being a Mongol ruler, sitting in your palace, and knowing that if something important happened on the other side of your empire, you'd hear about it before the week was over. This wasn't magic. This was organization, on a scale the world had never seen. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Mongols didn't keep this system just for themselves. They opened it up to merchants, to traders, to anyone who could prove they belonged there. These traders carried special documents, like ancient passports, that guaranteed them protection. Not just protection, but supplies, fresh horses, food, shelter, everything they needed to cross continents. Of course, nothing was free. These merchants paid taxes. They shared information. They became, without really realizing it, part of a vast intelligence network. Every caravan that arrived brought more than silk or precious stones. It brought news, prices in distant markets, political rumors, stories of drought or plenty. The Mongols were getting real-time updates on their entire empire, just by being helpful to traders, and something beautiful happened along these roads. They became meeting places for minds. Picture this: a Persian astronomer, traveling west, stopping at the same station as a Chinese engineer heading east. They can't really speak each other's languages perfectly, but they're both curious people. They start drawing diagrams in the dirt, sharing ideas, comparing techniques. Meanwhile, an Italian merchant arrives, completely fascinated by both of them. He's never seen astronomical instruments like the Persian carries. The Chinese engineer shows him a printing technique he's never imagined. By the time they part ways, each has learned something that will change how they see the world. This happened constantly. Medical knowledge flowed like water, finding its level. Navigation secrets passed from ship captains to desert guides. Artistic styles blended and evolved. Military innovations spread faster than armies could march. The Mongols had accidentally created the world's first, truly global university. Except, the classrooms were roadside inns, and the professors were anyone with something interesting to share. Paper money, which seems so normal to us now, started traveling westward along these routes. People in Europe slowly learned about this strange concept, paying for things with decorated paper instead of heavy coins. Printing methods followed the same path. Imagine the first European to see a printed book after a lifetime of hand-copied manuscripts. The shock, the wonder, the immediate understanding that everything was about to change. Gunpowder knowledge made the same journey. This wasn't just about weapons. It was about mining, about construction, about completely new ways of shaping the physical world. Meanwhile, flowing eastward came glass-making techniques that had been perfected in distant workshops, artistic motifs that had evolved in completely different cultural contexts. Each technique, each idea, finding new soil where it could grow and change. The psychological transformation was perhaps even more remarkable than the practical one. For centuries, people had thought of distant lands as essentially mythical. Stories told by travelers, sure, but probably exaggerated. Probably impossible to reach, probably too dangerous to consider. Suddenly, these places felt real. Reachable. A young person in any part of the empire could reasonably dream of seeing the other side of the world, not as a fantasy, but as an actual possibility. This shift in thinking, this expansion of what felt possible, changed everything. Travel was still hard, don't misunderstand. Deserts were still scorching hot during the day, freezing cold at night. Mountains were still exhaustingly high. Rivers still flooded. Disease still spread through crowded caravans. But the random human dangers, the bandits, the corrupt officials, the local wars that could trap you for months, these became rare. Bandits learned quickly that attacking travelers under Mongol protection was essentially suicide. Local officials knew they'd be held personally responsible if crimes happened in their territory. The Mongols didn't make empty threats. If you failed to maintain order, the consequences were swift and severe. So, order was maintained. For the first time in history, someone could plan a journey across the entire known world and expect to travel under one system of laws, one guarantee of protection. You didn't have to negotiate new rules every few hundred miles. You didn't have to learn new customs every week. You didn't have to wonder if the next local ruler would decide you looked suspicious. This consistency was revolutionary. It meant people could think bigger thoughts, plan longer journeys, imagine larger possibilities. The world was still huge, still full of wonders and dangers, but it no longer felt completely unknowable. The roads themselves became symbols of something larger. They represented the idea that distance didn't have to mean isolation. That difference didn't have to mean hostility. That the world was vast enough for everyone, connected enough for anyone curious enough to explore it. And once people had tasted this possibility, once they'd experienced this sense of connection across continents, there was no going back. The world had become smaller in the most important way. Not smaller in size, but smaller in the human heart. Foreign had become familiar. Distant had become reachable. Different had become interesting rather than threatening. The Mongols built roads, but what they really built was a new way of thinking about the world. They showed that barriers were often just illusions, that with enough organization, enough commitment, enough vision, the impossible could become routine. And that lesson, once learned, could never be completely forgotten. After the great storms of conquest had passed, something unexpected began to unfold across the Mongol lands. Where once there had been destruction, a different kind of energy started to emerge. Cities that had crumbled under the weight of invasion found themselves becoming something entirely new. You see, the Mongols had discovered something that many conquerors before them had missed entirely. A destroyed city generates nothing, but a living, breathing urban center. Well, that was like owning a golden goose. These weren't just places where people lived anymore. They were machines that could produce wealth, day after day, year after year. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but when it did happen, it was remarkable to witness. Markets that had been silent for months suddenly filled with voices again. Warehouses that had stood empty began to bulge with goods from distant lands. The sound of hammers rang out as infrastructure was rebuilt, not just to what it had been, but often to something better. The Mongols understood something profound about human nature. A merchant who's well-fed, who has a safe place to rest his head, who knows his goods are secure, that merchant will keep traveling. And traveling merchants meant money, flowing through the empire like water through carefully built channels. What made these cities truly fascinating, though, was how they became these incredible mixing bowls of humanity. Picture walking through a single marketplace and hearing 5 different languages being spoken at once. Over there, a Chinese merchant carefully displays his silk, the fabric catching the light in ways that make it seem almost alive. A few stalls down, a Persian financier calculates exchange rates with the precision of a master craftsman. Armenian artisans work with tools and techniques passed down through generations, while Italian traders negotiate deals that will take them halfway around the known world. All of these people, from such different backgrounds, operating under the same set of rules, the same legal framework. It was like watching the world shrink before your very eyes. The Mongols themselves often preferred to stay in the shadows of this urban theater. They were the directors, not the actors on stage. Local officials handled the day-to-day business of running things, while the Mongol administrators made sure the taxes flowed upward and that order was maintained. It was a delicate balance, like keeping multiple spinning plates in the air at once. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of this system was how the Mongols treated skilled workers. They saw talent the way a gardener sees seeds, something to be planted where it would grow best. A brilliant Chinese engineer might find himself suddenly relocated to the Middle East. His knowledge of siege warfare, desperately needed in some distant campaign. A Persian doctor, renowned for his healing abilities, could wake up one day to discover he was being sent to Central Asia, where his skills were required. This wasn't always voluntary, of course. Personal freedom often took a back seat to imperial needs. But the result was something unprecedented in human history. Knowledge began to spread at a speed that would have been unimaginable just generations before. Techniques that had been closely guarded secrets in one part of the world suddenly appeared thousands of miles away. The Mongols also brought something else to urban life. Something that might seem mundane, but was actually revolutionary. They brought the power of the written record. Census taking became an art form. Tax categories were standardized across vast distances. Urban populations weren't just governed, they were counted, classified, and monitored with a precision that was almost scientific. Now, this might sound oppressive, and in some ways it certainly was. But there was an unexpected benefit to all this bureaucracy. Predictability became a gift to the common people. When you know exactly what's expected of you, when the rules are clear and consistent, life becomes easier to navigate. No more arbitrary demands from local officials who might be having a bad day. Of course, not every city found itself riding this wave of prosperity. Location became destiny in ways that heritage never had been. An ancient city with centuries of proud history could find itself slowly fading into irrelevance if it happened to be positioned away from the major trade routes. Meanwhile, some small town that nobody had ever heard of could suddenly explode into importance simply because it sat at the right crossroads. Geography became more powerful than ancestry, more important than tradition. The Mongols cared about results, not pedigree. What emerged from all of this was something that historians would later call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. But in these urban centers, it wasn't really about peace in the way we might imagine it. It wasn't the peace of a quiet countryside or a sleepy village. It was the peace of constant motion, of deals being struck and goods being moved, of different cultures learning to work together, because there was money to be made. The walls of these cities still stood, of course, but they began to serve a different purpose. They weren't really fortresses anymore, designed to keep enemies out. They were more like the boundaries of a great marketplace, defining the space where this incredible human experiment was taking place. Commerce had become more important than defense, trade more valuable than warfare. In these bustling urban spaces, you could feel the Mongol peace not as some grand political concept, but as something much more immediate and real. It was in the daily movement of people and goods, in the constant noise of negotiation and deal-making, in the sight of strangers from distant lands working side by side toward common goals. Picture roads stretching across continents, carrying more than just merchants with their goods. These ancient highways became rivers of human thought, flowing from one civilization to another. Knowledge itself became a traveler, moving quietly alongside the caravans. The Mongol Empire hadn't planned to become history's greatest librarian. They simply wanted secure borders and stable trade routes. But when you remove the walls between worlds, something magical happens. Ideas begin to wander, like seeds carried on the wind. In the workshops of China, craftsmen had been making paper for centuries. This simple invention, born from mulberry bark and old rags, began its slow journey westward. Village by village, city by city, the secret spread. Soon, scribes across Asia were abandoning heavy stone tablets and expensive parchment. Paper brought a friend along for the journey. Printing, that revolutionary idea of pressing ink onto pages, followed the same dusty roads. Imagine the first time a scholar in Persia saw pages emerging from a wooden press, identical copies multiplying like magic. Books, once rare treasures copied by hand, began appearing in numbers that would have seemed impossible just generations before. Then came gunpowder, that curious mixture discovered by Chinese alchemists seeking immortality. What started as colorful explosions for festivals slowly transformed into something far more serious. Farm. The same as everything that is privacy. Warriors began to understand its potential. The thunder of cannons would eventually echo across battlefields from Europe to India, all because knowledge refused to stay put. Even the smallest innovations traveled these routes. Better stirrups meant riders could stay mounted during combat. Improved saddles allowed longer journeys. New navigation tools helped sailors find their way home. These humble inventions, passed from culture to culture, quietly changed how people moved through their world. Medical wisdom also made these journeys. Picture Islamic doctors sitting with Chinese physicians, comparing notes about healing herbs. They sketched diagrams of the human body, debated surgical techniques, shared remedies passed down through generations. Hospital corridors buzzed with conversations in multiple languages. As healers tried to unlock the mysteries of sickness and health, the stars themselves became subjects of international discussion. Astronomers from different continents compared their charts, refined their measurements of celestial movements. Mathematicians shared formulas, geographers drew more accurate maps. The universe seemed smaller when viewed through so many different eyes. Faith, too, walked these ancient highways. Buddhist monks ventured west, carrying scrolls of wisdom. Muslim scholars traveled east, engaging in theological debates. Christian missionaries hoped to plant new churches in distant lands. Nestorian priests found communities willing to listen to their message. The Mongol rulers maintained a peculiar tolerance for these spiritual wanderers. Different faiths coexisted, sometimes competing, sometimes learning from each other. Travelers wrote detailed accounts of foreign customs, strange rituals, unfamiliar beliefs. These writings became windows between worlds, though the glass was often clouded by misunderstanding and cultural bias. But connectivity carried darker passengers. The same ships that brought silk and spices also brought invisible stowaways. Diseases that had slumbered in isolation suddenly found new hosts, new cities to devastate. Pathogens became unwelcome tourists, spreading faster than any human traveler. The plague that would later sweep across continents followed these established trade routes like a nightmare caravan. City after city fell to an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't understand. The very networks that had brought prosperity now delivered catastrophe with terrifying efficiency. Isolation, for all its limitations, had once provided crude protection. Mountain ranges, deserts, and vast oceans had acted as natural barriers against both ideas and illnesses. When the Mongols connected these separated worlds, they removed humanity's ancient shields. This great linking changed everything forever. Progress and disaster now shared the same pathways. Civilizations could no longer experience triumph or tragedy in solitude. The world had become one vast interconnected web, where a discovery in one corner could reshape life in another. The Mongol peace had created something unprecedented in human history. A world where knowledge flowed like water, finding its way into a corner of human civilization. But water, as any flood survivor knows, can both nourish and destroy. Picture a time when the world suddenly became much smaller, when distant lands that had seemed like fairy tales became real destinations for merchants with heavy purses and ambitious dreams. The Mongol Empire had done something extraordinary, something that would echo through centuries. They had taken the dangerous, unpredictable world of ancient trade and turned it into something resembling a vast, well-oiled machine. Before this moment, a merchant planning a journey was like a sailor setting out into uncharted waters. Every kingdom had different rules, different taxes, different ways of settling disputes. What worked in one place might get you thrown in prison in the next. The Mongols changed all of that with a sweep of their mighty hand. Suddenly the same laws applied, whether you were crossing the steppes of Central Asia or the bustling markets of distant cities. This wasn't just about making life easier for traders, though it certainly did that. It was about creating something that had never existed before, a truly continental system where goods could flow like water, finding its course. Imagine silk threads spun in Chinese workshops, eventually draping the shoulders of nobles thousands of miles away. Picture precious stones from Indian mines, glittering in the hands of collectors who had never seen the subcontinent. The spices that made food come alive, the silver that made coins shine, the textiles that turned simple clothing into works of art. All of these treasures began moving in volumes that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. These weren't just trinkets for kings and queens anymore. A whole new class of people was emerging, merchants who had grown wealthy enough to build fine houses, influence local politics, and commission beautiful art. Something fascinating was happening to the very nature of power itself. For thousands of years, owning land had been the surest path to influence and respect. Now, trade wealth was challenging that ancient hierarchy. A clever merchant with the right connections could suddenly find himself dining with nobles who might once have looked down on anyone who worked with their hands. The Mongol rulers weren't just tolerating this transformation, they were actively encouraging it. They understood something that many empires had missed, that prosperous merchants meant prosperous tax collections. They offered legal privileges to traders, sometimes even becoming business partners with them. When caravans faced losses from bandits or natural disasters, the empire sometimes stepped in to cover the damages. This support led to innovations that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. Credit systems expanded like spiderwebs across continents, allowing merchants to borrow money in one city and repay it in another, months later and thousands of miles away. Bills of exchange meant that a trader no longer had to carry heavy chests of coins on dangerous roads. Money itself was becoming more like an idea than a physical thing. The changes weren't just economic, they were reshaping the very fabric of society. Cities along the major trade routes transformed into cosmopolitan melting pots, where you might hear a dozen languages in a single marketplace. Rural areas that had once focused on feeding their immediate neighbors now found themselves producing goods for customers they would never meet, living in places they could barely imagine. Artisans began adapting their crafts to appeal to foreign tastes. A potter in one region might start incorporating designs that would appeal to buyers thousands of miles away. Clothing styles began blending as fashion influences traveled with the merchant caravans.
Even food preferences started crossing borders, as spices and cooking techniques spread, along with the goods that carried them.
The interconnectedness was remarkable, and sometimes unsettling. A drought in one region could now affect prices in distant markets. A political upheaval in one kingdom could ripple across continents, affecting the livelihoods of people who had never heard of the original conflict. The world was becoming a web where pulling one strand could make the entire structure tremble. Of course, this entire system rested on something that was both powerful and fragile: Mongol authority. The peace that made long-distance trade possible wasn't maintained through gentle diplomacy. It was enforced by the very real memory of what happened to those who interfered with Mongol interests. Bandits thought twice before attacking caravans when they knew that Mongol retribution was swift and terrible. This was protection through strength, not through negotiation. The marketplace peace existed because everyone understood the consequences of disturbing it. Yet for those living within this system, the benefits were extraordinary. Trade created opportunities that previous generations could never have imagined. It offered mobility to people whose ancestors had been bound to single locations their entire lives. Wealth flowed in new directions, connecting the fortunes of people separated by vast distances. A successful harvest in one land could bring prosperity to traders in another. The failure of a mine in one region could affect the jewelry markets in cities that existed on different continents entirely. In transforming Eurasia into this connected economic zone, the Mongol peace had done something profound. It had taken trade from being a dangerous gamble, something only the most desperate or adventurous would attempt, and turned it into a structured enterprise with predictable rules and reasonable expectations of success. Borders became more like suggestions than absolute barriers. Markets expanded beyond anything the ancient world had known. The planet was learning what it meant when distant regions became economically dependent on each other. When the fate of one area could influence the prosperity of places that existed beyond the horizon. The grand empire that stretched across continents carried within it the seeds of its own unraveling. Picture this vast network, humming with activity and trade. Yet beneath that bustling surface, something was quietly shifting. The very immensity that once made the Mongols unstoppable slowly began to work against them. Think about trying to hold water in your cupped hands. The more you try to contain, the more likely it is to slip through your fingers. Governing territories that spanned from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean demanded something almost impossible: perfect coordination across thousands of miles. Every message took weeks to travel. Every decision rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. When powerful leaders died, chaos followed like clockwork. The Mongol way didn't establish neat lines of succession, the kind that European kingdoms relied on. Instead, brothers eyed, brothers' cousins plotted against uncles, and sons challenged fathers' chosen heirs. Each funeral became a political earthquake, sending tremors through entire regions. Imagine being a merchant in those times, watching as the local governor you'd known for years suddenly found himself replaced by someone's ambitious nephew. The roads stayed open, sure, but the decisions that kept them safe grew slower and more uncertain. Regional leaders, once obedient servants of the great Khan, started thinking for themselves. The empire began splitting, like a river dividing into countless streams. These separate territories, called Khanates, each developed their own priorities, their own ways of doing things. What had been one unified system slowly became several competing interests, all wearing the same Mongol name. Money problems followed political ones, as they always do. Those magnificent roads, with their relay stations and military patrols, cost enormous amounts to maintain. Think of it like keeping up a massive house. Every room needs attention. Every corridor requires upkeep. As the central government's grip loosened, funding dried up like wells in summer. Corruption crept in, the way weeds grow through cracks in pavement. Officials who once feared severe punishment now saw opportunities for personal gain. The system that had been built on absolute accountability started operating on loose promises and convenient oversights. Merchants still traveled, but they began to worry more, checking over their shoulders, weighing risks they'd never had to consider before. Nature itself seemed to turn against the empire. Climate shifts affected grasslands, where Mongol horses grazed, and farms that fed growing populations. The nomadic lifestyle that had created these incredible warriors required vast open spaces and reliable weather patterns. When droughts hit the steppes, or unusual cold killed livestock, the very foundation of Mongol power began to crack. Famine spread like wildfire through communities. The wealthy elite, accustomed to abundance and luxury, suddenly found themselves competing for basic resources. An empire built on constant movement, on the freedom to migrate with the seasons, struggled when environmental pressures made movement difficult. Disease added its own cruel mathematics to the empire's troubles. Plague swept through interconnected trade routes. The same networks that had once carried silk and spices now carried death from city to city. Entire administrative centers vanished, leaving power vacuums that no one could fill quickly enough. The beautiful connectivity that had made the empire prosperous now amplified every crisis. Communities disappeared overnight, taking with them decades of local knowledge and established relationships. Economic shockwaves followed, as trade partnerships dissolved and skilled craftsmen were lost forever. What had been the empire's greatest strength, its intricate web of connections, became a highway for catastrophe. Perhaps most fascinating of all, fear itself began to lose its power. The terror that had initially conquered nations was fading like old photographs. Children grew up under Mongol rule without ever witnessing the devastating military campaigns their grandparents remembered. Peace, ironically, weakened the very reputation that had created peace. New generations knew the Mongols as administrators and tax collectors, not as the unstoppable force that had once leveled entire cities. Authority built on fearsome reputation requires constant reinforcement, like a fire that needs feeding. The empire increasingly lacked the unity necessary to remind the world why it should remain afraid. The Mongol peace had always been conditional, a delicate agreement between strength and submission. It depended on momentum, on the sense that resistance was futile and cooperation was rewarding. Once those assumptions began to waver, everything else followed. Cracks appeared slowly at first, then spread with increasing speed. Trade routes that had operated like clockwork started experiencing delays and disruptions. Security that had been taken for granted became patchy and unreliable. Political unity that had seemed permanent revealed itself as surprisingly fragile. What looked like the eternal reshaping of the world turned out to be more like a magnificent performance, brilliant and captivating, but ultimately temporary. The Mongol peace lasted about a century, which by medieval standards was quite remarkable. Yet time, ambition, and the natural tendency of all things toward entropy proved stronger than even the mightiest empire. After the great Mongol Empire began to fade, something fascinating happened. The world didn't just snap back to how things were before. You see, when you've tasted what connection feels like, it's hard to forget that flavor. For 100 years, people had lived with roads that actually worked, with messages that traveled faster than ever before, with the promise that distant lands weren't quite so distant after all. But empires, like all things, eventually crumble. The roads that once buzzed with travelers started to crack and split. Weeds pushed through the stones, those relay stations, where riders once changed horses and carried news across continents. They stood empty now. The wind whistled through abandoned buildings that had once been the arteries of the world's first global network. China decided it had had enough of foreign rule. The Yuan dynasty, those Mongol rulers who had governed the Middle Kingdom, found themselves swept away. A new purely Chinese dynasty took power, and they had very clear ideas about how things should be. No more foreign influence, they declared. No more of this openness to the world. China would return to its traditional ways. Thank you very much. But change, once it starts, has a way of spreading like ripples in a pond. Central Asia and the Middle East found themselves with these curious hybrid governments. They had pieces of Mongol administration, bits and pieces of how the great empire had run things, all mixed up with their own local customs and traditions. It was like trying to bake a cake with someone else's recipe but using your grandmother's ingredients. In Eastern Europe and Russia, the Mongol influence didn't disappear overnight. It was more like a slow sunset, taking its time to fade. But even as Mongol power weakened, you could still see their fingerprints everywhere. The way taxes were collected, how armies were organized, the very structure of government authority, all of it carried traces of that Mongol touch. Trade, that lifeblood of the connected world, faced new challenges. Borders that had once been porous became hard lines again. Conflicts that had been suppressed under Mongol authority flared back to life. Merchants, those eternal optimists who always find a way, simply adapted. If the land routes became too dangerous, well, there was always the sea. The Indian Ocean and Mediterranean became busier than ever. Ships replaced horses and camels as the carriers of silk and spices and ideas. In a strange twist, the decline of the great land empire pushed people toward the waters, setting the stage for the age of maritime exploration that would follow. Knowledge, once it's released into the world, has a stubborn way of surviving. All those texts that had been translated during the Mongol peace, they kept circulating. Scholars in Baghdad still read Chinese philosophy. European monks continued to copy works that had traveled the Silk Road. Technologies that had crossed continents during the Mongol era didn't just disappear either. Gunpowder, that explosive innovation, continued to evolve in different corners of the world. Printing techniques spread and improved. Navigational tools became more sophisticated. Each region took these gifts from the Mongol era and made them their own, like musicians taking a melody and creating new variations. The memory of imperial unity became something complex for later rulers to wrestle with. On one hand, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign conquest, but on the other hand, it was proof that vast, diverse territories could be governed as one. The Ottomans, in their rise to power, quietly borrowed Mongol administrative techniques. The Ming dynasty in China, despite their rhetoric about rejecting foreign influence, adopted certain Mongol practices for running their empire. Nobody wanted to admit they were copying the Mongols, of course, but the lessons were there, written in the success of that century of peace. Centralized authority worked. Standardized laws made sense. Protected trade routes brought prosperity. These weren't just theories anymore, they were proven facts. Yet the human cost of that great experiment remained visible for generations. Entire regions that had been devastated by war and plague struggled to rebuild. Communities that had been uprooted and scattered took decades to re-establish themselves. Some places never fully recovered. The benefits of connectivity had come with a price that echoed through time. When we look back at the end of the Pax Mongolica, it wasn't really an ending at all. It was more like a transformation, a metamorphosis from one type of world into another. The century of Mongol peace had demonstrated something remarkable about human possibility. It showed what could happen when distance stopped being an insurmountable barrier, when different cultures could coexist under one vast umbrella of authority. But it also revealed the dangers of putting too much of the world under one system. When that system faltered, the effects rippled everywhere. The Mongol peace holds this unique position in our story as a species. It was an experiment in global governance that happened centuries before we had words for such concepts. A preview of interconnectedness that wouldn't be matched again until our modern era. Picture this vast expanse of land stretching from the edges of Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. For about 100 years, something extraordinary happened across this enormous territory. It wasn't born from noble intentions or dreams of peace. Instead, it emerged from something much darker, much more violent. The Mongols had swept across continents like a storm, leaving destruction in their wake. Bayan Star, cities burned, populations fled, entire civilizations trembled at the sound of thundering hooves. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. After all that conquest, after all that fear, something remarkable began to take shape. You see, the Mongols weren't interested in changing how people lived their daily lives. They didn't care if you spoke Chinese or Persian or Russian. Your religion, your customs, your local traditions, none of that mattered to them. What they cared about was one simple thing: obedience to their system. This indifference, as cold as it sounds, actually created something unprecedented. Imagine being able to travel from one end of the known world to the other, carrying goods, ideas, or simply your own curiosity, and finding the same basic rules everywhere you went. The same protection, the same relative safety. A merchant could load up his caravan in Venice and travel all the way to Beijing, knowing that the roads would be patrolled, that bandits would be rare, that there was a system in place to protect trade. Technologies that had been locked away in one corner of the world suddenly found themselves spreading like seeds on the wind. But this connection came with a price, as all connections do. When things move freely across vast distances, everything moves, not just the good things. Ideas multiplied rapidly, yes, but so did diseases. Wealth flowed along these protected routes, but so did instability when things went wrong. The Black Death, the terrible plague that would later devastate Europe, traveled along these same networks that had brought such prosperity. It's a reminder that when you connect the world, you connect everything, the beautiful and the terrifying alike. The Mongols themselves probably never sat around planning to revolutionize global trade or accelerate the spread of technology. They were focused on conquest, on control, on building something that had never existed before. But history has this funny way of creating consequences that no one intended. Europe, which had been relatively isolated, suddenly found itself aware of a much larger world. Asian trade networks expanded beyond anything previously imagined. The groundwork was being laid for future explorations, future empires, future connections that would reshape everything. And then, as all things do, it ended. The central power that had held this vast system together began to weaken. The Mongol Empire fractured, broke apart, dissolved into smaller pieces. The roads became dangerous again. The unified system of law and protection crumbled. But something interesting happened. Even though the empire was gone, the idea of what had been possible remained. People remembered that the world could be connected. They remembered that knowledge could travel freely, that distance could be conquered, that continents could function as parts of a single, enormous stage. This memory, this echo of what had once existed, never really disappeared. It lingered in the human imagination, like a half-remembered dream. Future explorers, future traders, future empire builders would carry with them this notion that the world could be united, could be connected, could be traversed. The Mongol peace had shown humanity something profound about itself. It revealed that we are capable of creating systems that span incredible distances, that bring together people who have nothing in common except their shared humanity. But it also showed the fragility of such systems, how quickly they can collapse when the forces holding them together weaken. There's something almost haunting about this legacy. An empire built on violence and fear somehow managed to create the conditions for unprecedented exchange and growth. The very roads that had carried conquering armies later carried silk and spices, mathematical treatises and religious texts, artistic techniques, and agricultural innovations. It makes you wonder about the strange ways history works, how the intentions of those in power so rarely match the actual consequences of their actions, how systems designed for control can accidentally create freedom, how empires built to last forever can disappear almost overnight, leaving behind only traces, only memories, only the faint outline of what once was possible. The world today, with all its global connections, its instant communication, its international trade networks, carries within it some DNA from that distant century. Not the violence, not the conquest, but the basic idea that distance is not permanent, that barriers can be overcome, that the human world can function as a single, interconnected whole. In quiet moments, when you think about how a package can travel from one side of the earth to the other, or how an idea can spread across continents in seconds, you're witnessing the distant echo of something that began centuries ago on the steppes of Mongolia. A reminder that even the most unlikely sources can give birth to the most transformative changes. Picture the earliest humans huddled around flickering fires, and you'll find something extraordinary happening. Long before anyone thought to build a theater, before scripts existed, before anyone even had a name for what they were doing, people were performing, not for applause, not for entertainment, but for something much more urgent, survival itself. In those ancient times, performance wasn't something you watched from a comfortable seat. It was something you lived, something you breathed, something you joined with your whole being. When the seasons shifted, when storms approached, when someone died or when a child was born, the community didn't just observe these moments. They enacted them, they became them. They transformed them into something sacred through movement and voice. The human body became the first stage, the first instrument, the first storyteller. Imagine dancers moving like the animals they hunted, their bodies twisting and leaping in perfect mimicry. Picture masks carved from wood and bone, transforming ordinary people into spirits, into gods, into the forces that seem to control their world. These weren't costumes in our modern sense. They were doorways, passages from the human realm into something far more powerful. Rain dances weren't quaint rituals to these early peoples. They were negotiations with the cosmos, desperate attempts to speak the language of thunder and storm. When crops failed, when illness spread, when the hunt brought back nothing, the failure belonged to everyone who had participated in the ritual. There was no audience sitting safely apart, no critics to judge the performance. Everyone shared the responsibility, everyone carried the weight of success or failure. Communities discovered that performance could teach without schools, could preserve history without books, could pass down wisdom without writing. Stories lived in the bodies of dancers, in the rhythm of drums, in the careful repetition of gestures that had been refined over generations. Heroes weren't described in these early performances, they were embodied. Battles weren't recounted, they were danced. Moral lessons weren't explained, they were sung directly into the muscle memory of those who participated. Even before formal governments existed, performance was already political. Chiefs and leaders understood instinctively that power needed to be seen, needed to be felt, needed to become visible through spectacle. When a leader wore sacred regalia or presided over a ceremony, they weren't just organizing an event. They were demonstrating their connection to forces beyond human understanding, positioning themselves as bridges between the earthly and the divine. The rhythm of these early performances followed the rhythm of life itself. Harvest festivals, ceremonies for the dead, rituals marking the passage from childhood to adulthood. Performance helped communities make sense of time, helped them feel connected to cycles larger than their individual lives. It taught people not just what to believe, but how to feel together, how to grieve together, how to celebrate together. What's remarkable is how these early forms of performance created their own architecture, not of stone or wood, but of shared understanding. People learned to read the language of gesture, to understand when a particular movement meant danger, when a certain mask indicated the presence of an ancestor, when silence carried as much meaning as the loudest drum. These weren't casual entertainments that people could choose to attend or skip. They were essential gatherings, moments when the community renewed its understanding of itself, when shared values were reinforced, when the invisible bonds holding people together were made visible through collective action. To refuse participation wasn't just rude, it was a form of defiance that threatened the survival of the group. In the hills of ancient Greece, something began to shift in how people understood performance. The sacred didn't disappear, but it began to take new forms, more structured, more deliberate, more designed for watching rather than participating. What emerged was something we can recognize as theater, though it remained deeply connected to the divine, through festivals honoring Dionysus, the god who represented transformation, ecstasy, and the breaking down of ordinary boundaries. Greek tragedy wasn't entertainment in any casual sense. Attending these performances was considered a civic duty, something citizens owed to their city and to each other. The state funded these productions, understanding instinctively that shared stories helped hold society together. When thousands of people gathered in those great outdoor theaters carved into hillsides, they weren't seeking escape from reality. They were confronting the deepest, most troubling aspects of human existence. These plays examined questions that have no easy answers. What happens when duty conflicts with love? How do we bear guilt that can never be fully expiated? Why do the innocent suffer while the guilty prosper? The stories came from myth, but they spoke to immediate concerns. Kings fell from power, families destroyed themselves through pride and vengeance. Gods remained silent while humans struggled with impossible choices. The structure of these performances reflected their communal origins. The chorus remained central, representing the voice of the community, commenting on the action, warning the characters, expressing the collective wisdom and fear of ordinary people, watching extraordinary events unfold. Individual actors might portray heroes and kings, but the chorus reminded everyone that consequences ripple outward, that no action exists in isolation. Masks played a crucial role in maintaining this sense of universality. With their exaggerated expressions and standardized forms, they allowed actors to embody multiple roles while also ensuring that audiences focused on the archetypal nature of the characters rather than the individual psychology of the performers. These weren't personal stories, they were human stories, relevant to anyone who had ever faced moral complexity. The architecture itself reinforced the democratic nature of these gatherings. Built into natural amphitheaters, Greek theaters ensured that thousands could see and hear equally well. There were no private boxes, no exclusive sections, no way to experience the performance in isolation from the community. The open sky served as a roof, connecting the human drama below to the cosmic forces above. Perhaps most importantly, Greek tragedy introduced the radical idea that performance could question authority rather than simply reinforcing it. Kings and heroes were shown to be fallible, often tragically so. Divine justice appeared ambiguous, sometimes cruel, always mysterious. Citizens watching these plays were invited to think critically about power, about justice, about the responsibilities that come with living in a community. Greek comedy emerged from the same festivals as tragedy, but it chose to confront authority through laughter rather than tears. This wasn't gentle humor designed to amuse without offense. It was sharp, political, sometimes vicious satire that turned ridicule into a form of democratic participation. Comic playwrights felt free to mock politicians, generals, philosophers, even the gods themselves, understanding that laughter could deflate pretension more effectively than any argument. The audience became part of the performance in ways that tragedy rarely allowed. Comic playwrights broke the fourth wall regularly, addressing spectators directly, commenting on current events, abandoning the story entirely when it served their satirical purposes. This created an atmosphere of complicity, making the crowd participants in the act of judgment, rather than passive observers. Costumes and masks amplified the satirical effect. Oversized features, padded bodies, grotesque caricatures transformed recognizable public figures into absurd distortions. For a few hours, the normal hierarchies of society collapsed under the weight of communal laughter. A respected general could be reduced to a coward, a celebrated philosopher to a buffoon, a powerful politician to a figure of ridicule. This freedom, however, existed within careful boundaries. Comedy thrived during festivals, when ordinary rules were suspended, when criticism was not just tolerated, but encouraged. Outside those sacred times, the same words might be dangerous, even treasonous. The festival created a temporary space where society could examine its own failures and contradictions without tearing itself apart. Laughter served functions beyond entertainment. It addressed everyday anxieties about marriage, money, aging, sex, all the concerns that tragedy treated with elevated seriousness. By dramatizing shared worries in exaggerated form, comedy normalized them, helped people recognize that their private struggles were universal human experiences. The audience laughed not just at the characters on stage, but at recognizable aspects of themselves. In the Roman world, performance took on different characteristics, reflecting a culture more concerned with impact than contemplation, more focused on spectacle than philosophical reflection. Where Greek theatre invited thought, Roman theatre demanded immediate emotional response. The result was entertainment on a scale the world had never seen. Loud, physical, designed to overwhelm rather than challenge audiences. Roman theatres themselves announced this shift. Unlike Greek theatres that nestled into natural hillsides, Roman theatres stood as freestanding architectural monuments, proclaiming the power and permanence of the empire. The building became part of the message, reminding audiences of Roman engineering prowess and imperial grandeur. Before the performance even began, pantomime became especially popular, featuring masked dancers who told entire stories through gesture and movement alone. These performances required no complex dialogue, no philosophical subtlety. Meaning was communicated through the eloquent language of the body, accessible to audiences regardless of their education or native language. A single performer could embody multiple characters, shifting identity through posture and motion alone. Performance in Rome was inseparable from politics, but in a more direct way than in Greece. Public games and theatrical shows were sponsored by wealthy elites, seeking popular support. Entertainment became a currency of power, a way to demonstrate generosity while keeping potentially restless populations fed and distracted. The phrase bread and circuses captured this strategy perfectly. Actors occupied a paradoxical position in this system. While beloved by audiences, they were often viewed with suspicion or contempt by the upper classes. Performance was associated with deception, with emotional excess, with the dangerous ability to make falsehood appear true. An actor might portray gods and emperors on stage, yet be denied basic social respectability off it. Roman censorship operated differently than it had in Greece. Where Athenian comedy had directly mocked, named politicians, Roman satire was more cautious, more indirect. Critique happened through allegory, through mythological references, through exaggerated character types rather than personal attacks. The state had learned to manage dissent, rather than simply suppressing it. Rome transformed performance into an instrument of imperial control. Theatre entertained vast populations, unified diverse cultures under Roman rule, and provided emotional outlets that didn't threaten political stability. In this system, performance was no longer primarily sacred or communal. It was administered, managed, choreographed by the state itself. In ancient Egypt, performance never separated from its religious roots. There was no distinction between theatre and ritual, no boundary between entertainment and sacred ceremony. To perform was to participate in maintaining Mart, the divine principle of balance and harmony that kept the universe functioning. Each reenactment of sacred stories was believed to have real effects, to actually sustain the cosmic order. Temple rituals formed the heart of Egyptian performance culture. Priests didn't simply honor the gods through ceremony. They activated them. They called them into presence through precise movements, costumes, chants, and processions. These performances followed scripts that had been refined over centuries, handed down with meticulous care, because variation was dangerous, because getting the details wrong could disrupt the fundamental order of existence. The myth of Osiris was reenacted repeatedly across Egypt, not because audiences demanded novelty, but because the story needed to be kept alive through performance. The murder, dismemberment, and resurrection of the god promised renewal, fertility, and the continuity of kingship. Each performance renewed these promises, made them real again for another season. The pharaoh stood at the center of this performative universe. Every public appearance was carefully choreographed. Clothing, posture, gesture, all communicated divine authority. The king wasn't pretending to be a god, he was performing godhood as a function of rule. Without ceremony, authority dissolved, became merely human, merely fallible. Much of Egyptian performance was deliberately hidden from public view. Many rituals took place deep within temple complexes, seen only by priests and initiates. Mystery itself became part of the performance. What was unseen carried weight, precisely because it couldn't be observed, couldn't be judged, or questioned by ordinary people. Music and movement in these ceremonies was controlled, symbolic, not expressive in any personal sense. Individual performers mattered less than the precision of the ritual act. Improvisation was unthinkable. Mistakes carried cosmic consequences. Through exact repetition, performers linked the present to the distant past, ensured that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Egyptian performance was fundamentally conservative, designed to maintain rather than change, to preserve rather than challenge. It sought to make time stand still, to keep the universe in perfect balance, through the endless repetition of sacred stories. In ancient India, performance evolved along a path that blended ritual, philosophy, and aesthetic theory into something uniquely refined. Sanskrit drama wasn't designed to shock or overwhelm audiences. Instead, it sought harmony between performer and spectator, between story and emotion, between earthly life and cosmic understanding. Central to this tradition was the concept of rasa, often translated as flavor or essence. A successful performance was measured not by its plot twists or realistic effects, but by its ability to evoke specific emotional states in the audience. Love, sorrow, heroism, fear, wonder, serenity. These weren't just feelings to be experienced randomly. They were carefully cultivated through precise combinations of dialogue, gesture, music, and rhythm. Actors underwent rigorous training that turned their bodies into instruments of meaning. Every movement of hand, eye, foot carried significance. Facial expressions were codified. Posture signaled status, mood, intention. This wasn't casual entertainment. It was disciplined artistry, where precision mattered more than spontaneity. Sanskrit drama avoided the extremes of Greek tragedy. Death and despair might occur, but offstage, softened by poetic language and moral resolution. The goal was balance, not rupture, harmony, rather than catharsis. Even when suffering appeared in these plays, it pointed toward restoration and cosmic order. This approach reflected Hindu and Buddhist philosophies that emphasized cycles, detachment, the illusory nature of permanent identity. Characters in Sanskrit drama were archetypal rather than psychologically complex. Kings embodied justice, lovers embodied devotion, villains embodied disorder. Through these figures, audiences contemplated ethical and spiritual truths rather than individual psychology. Performance spaces were intimate, designed for courtly gatherings rather than mass audiences. The experience was communal but focused, encouraging attentive listening rather than spectacle. Music and song guided emotional transitions, helping audiences move smoothly from one rasa to another. Indian theatre served as a bridge between inner experience and outer expression. It taught audiences how to feel without losing control, how to witness emotion without being overwhelmed by it. Performance became training for understanding reality rather than escaping from it. Across all these ancient cultures, performance relied on the body as a universal language. Before widespread literacy, before common tongues, gesture, posture, and movement created meaning that could cross boundaries of speech and culture. The body became the most reliable storyteller, understood through sight as much as sound. Masks were central to this physical vocabulary. In Greece, Rome, Africa, Asia, masks transformed ordinary people into something beyond human. They exaggerated emotion, erased individual personality, allowed single performers to embody gods, spirits, multiple characters. The mask didn't hide the performer, it elevated them, dissolved personal identity in favor of archetypal meaning. Movement followed strict conventions in most traditions. A raised arm, a turned head, a measured step communicated status, intention, emotional state. These weren't arbitrary gestures, they were learned codes that allowed audiences to read relationships and power dynamics immediately, without explanation. Training for performers was rigorous, specialized. Actors weren't casual entertainers, they were craftspeople who spent years mastering breath control, balance, precise expression. Voice projection mattered, but so did controlled stillness. Silence could carry as much meaning as the loudest declaration. Dance occupied a unique space between theatre and ceremony. In Egypt, India, parts of the Mediterranean, dance told stories that words couldn't capture. Mythic narratives, cosmological truths, moral lessons unfolded to rhythm and repetition. Dancers didn't express personal emotions. They embodied shared cultural meanings. Audiences learned to read these physical signals like a complex language. Spectators understood when specific gestures indicated mourning, when pauses suggested divine intervention, when turns of the body marked betrayal or revelation. Performance reinforced shared codes of meaning, reminded communities that they spoke the same symbolic vocabulary. The body was treated as sacred territory in ancient performance. It was disciplined, trained, transformed into a vessel for meaning, larger than individual expression. Words could be forgotten or misunderstood, but movement endured, passed from performer to performer across generations. Ancient performance served as more than entertainment. It functioned as social adhesive, binding individuals into shared emotional and moral universes. When people gathered to watch a performance, they weren't simply consuming a story. They were participating in collective acts of recognition, affirming their identity as a community and their shared understanding of what mattered. Public performance created communal memory. Plays seen together became reference points long after actors left the stage. Lines were quoted, gestures imitated, scenes debated in marketplaces and homes. In societies with limited written records, these shared experiences helped preserve values, history, cultural identity across generations. Theatre functioned as a mirror, reflecting social roles, tensions, contradictions back to audiences. In forms that could be examined safely, kings watched themselves portrayed as just or tyrannical. Citizens saw their fears dramatized, families recognized their conflicts in mythic form. This reflection wasn't always comfortable, but it was controlled, bounded by the performance frame. Performance temporarily equalized experience in remarkable ways. In theaters, social hierarchies blurred, if only for a few hours. Elites and commoners sat within sight of each other, reacting to the same moments, sharing laughter, silence, grief. Emotional experience overrode status distinctions, creating temporary communities based on feeling rather than rank. Ancient societies understood that unchecked emotion could be dangerous to social stability. Theatre provided sanctioned outlets for grief, anger, desire, fear. Tragedy allowed sorrow to be felt deeply, but resolved symbolically. Comedy released tension through communal laughter. Ritual performance transformed anxiety into order, chaos into meaning. These experiences taught emotional regulation on a community level. Audiences practiced feeling together without losing control, learned to experience intense emotions within safe boundaries. The performance frame contained feeling while allowing it full expression. Festivals structured entire calendars around performance. These events marked seasons, victories, religious observances, community transitions. Participation signaled belonging, demonstrated membership in the cultural community. To attend was to affirm one's place in society. To understand the performance was to understand the culture itself. Ancient theatre was active cultural maintenance. It didn't simply reflect society. It helped hold communities together by reinforcing shared norms, testing moral boundaries, reminding people they were part of something larger than individual existence. By the end of antiquity, performance had created lasting legacies that extended far beyond crumbling theatres and forgotten scripts. Ancient theatre had established patterns of storytelling, emotional structure, community gathering that would survive political upheavals and religious transformations. As empires declined and new religious priorities emerged, many forms of ancient performance disappeared or transformed radically. Greek theatres fell into ruins, Roman spectacles lost their audiences, temple rituals were suppressed or reinterpreted. Yet the fundamental idea that stories could be embodied, staged, shared, publicly survived these changes. Medieval religious drama, court performances, later theatrical traditions all carried traces of ancient practice, even when their creators no longer remembered the sources. The expectation that performance was something meant to be witnessed collectively, that stories gained power when shared rather than consumed privately, proved remarkably persistent. The sacred dimension survived in altered forms. Ritual drama evolved into morality, plays mystery cycles, symbolic reenactments of religious narratives. Emotion continued to be structured and guided through performance, echoing older traditions where theatre taught people how to feel, how to grieve, how to celebrate together. Ancient performance established the fundamental architecture of theatrical space. Modern theatre still inherit assumptions about sightlines, acoustics, audience focus that were first tested in stone amphitheatres and temple courtyards. The basic relationship between performer and spectator was defined in these ancient venues. Most importantly, ancient theatre established performance as a method of preserving community identity across time. Stories repeated through generations became anchors during periods of change, ways for communities to remember who they had been while adapting to new circumstances. Through reenactment, the past remained present, not as static memory but as lived, breathing experience. The legacy extends beyond formal theatre into any moment when people gather to watch stories unfold together. Every time a community shares narrative experience, it echoes practices that once shaped entire civilizations, that help define what it means to be human, social, connected to something larger than individual existence. Ancient performance was simultaneously sacred, political, and communal, serving needs that persist across cultures and centuries. Its influence lives not in museums or textbooks, but in the continuing human impulse to gather, to watch, to share stories that help make sense of existence itself.